The widow sold hot coffee at dawn, until the quiet blacksmith asked why she never sat down. By the time the first wagon wheels began to creak down Mesilla Street, Ruth Bellamy had already been awake for 3 hours. That was how every morning had gone since her husband died under a collapsed freight shed the previous winter. Before the town lamps went out, before the bakery boys swept flour off their boots, before the stage office opened its shutters, Ruth stood behind a little plank counter beneath the awning of the old livery and poured coffee from a dented blue pot. "Hot coffee," she called into the cold New Mexico dawn, her voice steady though her hands were often tired. 3 cents a cup, fresh corn cakes, 2 for a nickel. No one in Las Cruces thought of it as a business. Not really. They thought of it as poor widow Bellamy doing what she could. Men bought from her because the coffee was strong, because the cakes were warm, and because a woman with 2 small rooms behind the livery and a lame younger brother could not live on sympathy. Ruth did not ask for sympathy. She measured beans by the handful, cut the cornmeal with care, stretched a sack of flour until it seemed like a miracle, and kept a little tin box beneath the counter where every coin had a place. 1 stack for rent, 1 stack for medicine, 1 stack for the old debt her husband had left at the freight office, though Ruth had never seen the full paper with her own eyes. That morning in March of 1889, the wind came sharp off the Oregon mountains and slipped beneath her shawl. She pulled it tighter and set 4 tin cups in a row. The stage was due by 7. The teamsters would want coffee before then. Her brother Jonah sat on an upturned crate near the back wall, mending a harness strap with slow, careful fingers. He was 17, thin as a fence rail, with a crooked right leg from a childhood fever. He hated being watched, hated being helped, and hated most of all when Ruth told him to rest. "You'll rub that leather through if you keep worrying it," she said. "I'm not worrying it," he answered. "I'm fixing it. That strap belongs to Mr. Prout. If it comes back prettier than when he left it, he'll accuse us of showing off." Jonah looked up, almost smiling. Ruth liked when she could still make him do that. Some mornings it felt like the whole world had taken its weight and laid it across the boy's shoulders before he'd even had a chance to grow into them. The first customer was old Mr. Daly from the telegraph office. He paid exact, drank fast, and never spoke unless weather was involved. After him came 2 mule drivers, a woman carrying laundry, and a young hand from the feed yard who always bought 1 corn cake and stared at the second like hunger had a face. Ruth gave him both. He noticed the extra one and flushed. "Mrs. Bellamy, I only paid for 1. "Then bring the cup back clean," she said. The boy nodded and hurried away. Jonah watched her from the crate. "You'll never get ahead doing that." "I got ahead of his hunger." "That doesn't pay rent." "No," Ruth said softly. "But it pays something." She was pouring another cup when the blacksmith across the street opened his doors. Ruth had seen him for 3 weeks now, though she had not properly met him. The old blacksmith, Mr. Larkin, had sold the shop in February after his hands began to shake too badly to hold tongs. The new man had come with 1 wagon, 2 draft horses, and not much else anyone could name. He worked before sunrise and after dark. He wore no wedding ring. He spoke politely when spoken to, but not often. His name, according to Jonah, was Samuel Vale. According to the town women, he was either grieving, hiding, or simply born without the habit of conversation. Ruth had no opinion on it. She had enough trouble of her own without collecting mysteries from across the street. Samuel stepped out with his sleeves rolled, carrying a broken wagon hinge. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, not handsome in the polished way of men who knew mirrors liked them. His face was weathered, serious, with dark hair that fell over his forehead when he bent to work. There was a burn scar along 1 wrist, pale against the skin, and Ruth noticed it only because he never tried to hide it. He crossed the street just as the sun began to lift behind the rooftops. "Coffee?" Ruth asked. "Yes, ma'am." She filled a cup. He set down 5 cents. "Coffee is 3. "I'll take a corn cake, too." "That makes 5. "I know." There was no smile when he said it, but there was something almost gentle in his eyes, as if he had learned to keep kindness quiet so no one could strike it. Ruth wrapped a corn cake in brown paper and handed it over. Samuel took one bite, paused, then looked at the counter more carefully. "You make these yourself?" "Before dawn. Every day. Every day the town keeps eating." He nodded like that answer made more sense to him than it should have. His gaze shifted to Jonah, then to the mended harness strap, but he did not ask the questions people usually asked. "What happened to his leg? Can he work? Is he your boy? Is there no man to help you?" Instead, Samuel said, "That stitch will hold better if you wet the leather first." Jonah stiffened. Ruth felt it at once. "He knows what he's doing." Samuel looked back at her. "I expect he does. I only meant there's a trough at my shop if he wants water that isn't half coffee grounds." For a moment no one spoke. Then Jonah stood with the strap in hand. "I can fetch my own water." "I figured," Samuel said. That was all. No pity, no soft voice, no careful eyes. Jonah limped across the street with his chin lifted, and Ruth watched him go with a strange ache in her chest. Samuel remained beside the counter. "You just won him over," she said. "No, ma'am, I only didn't lose him." This time Ruth nearly smiled. A wagon rattled by, the driver lifting 2 fingers in greeting. Somewhere down the street, the stage office bell rang once. The town was waking fully now, and with it came the ordinary noise that let Ruth hide inside her work. Samuel finished the corn cake slowly. When he was done, he looked at the coffee pot, then at the little stool behind her counter, the stool she never used. "You been standing since before sunup?" he asked. "Most folks have." "Most folks sit when they can." "I'm not most folks." "No," he said, "I noticed." It was not flirtation the way men at the saloon sometimes made it, loud and empty. It was plain, almost clumsy, and somehow that made it harder to answer. Ruth reached for another cup, though no one had asked for one. "Did you need something else, Mr. Vale?" "Samuel," he said, "and yes." She waited. "I need 2 cups of coffee tomorrow." "For your helper?" "For me." He glanced toward his shop, where Jonah was now pretending not to inspect every tool within reach. "And for you, if you'll sit down long enough to drink one." Ruth stared at him. The street noise seemed to move farther away. "I sell coffee," she said. "I know. I don't sit with customers." "I know that too." "Then why ask?" Samuel's face changed a little, not into a smile, but into the memory of one. "Because a woman who feeds half the street before breakfast ought to have someone pour for her once." Ruth looked down at the counter. The tin cups, the dented pot, the little box of coins hidden beneath the plank. She thought of rent due Saturday, medicine running low, the debt paper she had never been allowed to read, and the freight boss who looked at her like patience itself was a loan he meant to collect. Then she looked across the street and saw Jonah standing inside the blacksmith shop, holding the harness strap under a clean stream of water, listening while Samuel's apprentice showed him how to soften the leather without weakening it. Her throat tightened. "I open at 5, she said. "I light the forge at 4. That wasn't an invitation. "No," Samuel said, "but it wasn't a refusal." Ruth should have corrected him. Instead, she poured coffee for the stage driver, counted 3 cents into her tin, and kept her eyes on her work until Samuel went back across the street. Only when he was gone did she sit on the stool for the first time that morning. The coffee in the pot had gone a little bitter. She drank it anyway. The next morning, Ruth came to Mesilla Street carrying the blue coffee pot in one hand and a covered basket in the other, telling herself she had not thought about Samuel Vale's offer once. That was a lie, and she knew it before she reached the livery awning. She had thought of it while grinding beans in the dark. She had thought of it while stirring cornmeal with one hand and holding the lamp steady with the other. She had thought of it while helping Jonah pull on his boot, the one with the lifted heel that kept his step from dragging too badly. She had even thought of it while counting the last of the coins in the rent stack and finding them still short by 62 cents. A woman who feeds half the street before breakfast ought to have someone pour for her once. It was foolish. A sentence like that did not pay rent. It did not settle accounts. It did not put medicine on the shelf or flour in the barrel. Still, it had followed her around the little room behind the livery like a candle flame she could not blow out. Jonah noticed. "You're quiet," he said as he limped beside her. "I'm always quiet in the morning." "No, your business quiet most mornings. This is thinking quiet." "There's a difference." "To me." Ruth gave him the basket. "Then think about not dropping the corn cakes." He tucked the basket beneath his arm with great dignity. "I never dropped them but once." "You dropped 6. The ground was clean." "The ground is never clean." "It was clean enough for chickens." "That is not the measure I prefer for customers." He grinned, and Ruth felt that same small relief she always felt when the boy still sounded like a boy. Since his fever, people in town spoke of Jonah as if his life had already narrowed into something small and fixed. Ruth refused to let him believe it. She gave him work not because she needed it, though she did, but because hands needed purpose and pride needed room. The street was not fully awake yet. A thin blue dark sat between the buildings. The blacksmith shop across the road already glowed orange through the cracks around the door. Samuel had kept his word. The forge was lit. Ruth set the counter in order. Cups to the left. Corn cakes wrapped in cloth to keep warm. Coin box beneath the plank. A little ledger beside the pot because numbers did not frighten her when they were written down. Numbers frightened her only when men like Mr. Asaprut at the freight office folded them into papers and told her not to trouble herself with the details. She was laying out the first row of cups when the blacksmith door opened. Samuel crossed the street carrying 2 tin cups and a small covered pan wrapped in a towel. Ruth looked at the cups. "I have cups." "I know. I have coffee too." "I know that also." "Then you are starting this morning with unnecessary supplies." "I've been accused of worse." Jonah sat on his crate, watching them with open interest. Ruth gave him one sharp look. "Harness straps do not mend themselves." Jonah picked up the strap and bent over it, though his ears remained pointed straight at the conversation. Samuel set the 2 cups on the counter and uncovered the pan. Inside were potatoes sliced thin, fried brown with onion and a little salt. Ruth stared at them. "I had extra," he said. "No man fries potatoes before dawn because he had extra." "I do." "That sounds like a warning." "It might be." He poured coffee from her pot into one of his cups, then into the other. He handed one to her and waited. Ruth did not take it. Across the street, the forge breathed light into the morning. Somewhere far down the road, a mule brayed. The first wagon had not yet come. No customer stood waiting. No task would fail if she took a cup and sat for 3 minutes. That was what unsettled her. For nearly a year she had kept moving because stopping gave sorrow a chance to catch up. If she stood, poured, counted, washed, baked, and carried, then grief remained a shadow at her back. If she sat, it might sit beside her. Samuel seemed to understand enough not to say anything. At last Ruth took the cup. 3 minutes. "I asked for coffee, not a treaty." 3 minutes is generous." She sat on the stool behind the counter. Samuel remained standing on the customer's side. Ruth looked up at him. "You said sit." "I meant you." "You brought 2 cups." "I can drink standing." "That defeats your whole argument." "My argument was about you." "Then it was a poor argument." This time he did smile. It was brief, quiet, but it warmed his whole face in a way Ruth had not expected. The seriousness did not leave him. It only opened enough to show there was something living behind it. Jonah coughed into his hand. Ruth ignored him and took a drink. The coffee was the same coffee she served every morning, but sitting down made it taste different. She did not know whether she liked that. Samuel pushed the pan of potatoes closer. "Eat." "I have corn cakes." "You sell corn cakes." "I also eat them." "When?" Ruth looked away. Samuel did not press. He only set a fork on the counter, handle toward her, and drank from his own cup. For 3 minutes the street belonged to them alone. Then old Mr. Daly came for his coffee, and the day began. Samuel stepped aside as if nothing unusual had happened. Ruth rose at once, poured coffee, counted coins, wrapped corn cakes, answered questions, and moved with the practiced swiftness of a woman who knew how to make work look easier than it was. But the morning had changed. Not enough for anyone else to see, perhaps. Enough for her. At 7:30, Mr. Asa Prout came down from the freight office. Ruth felt Jonah go still before she looked up. Prout was a narrow man in a black coat too fine for street dust. He had pale eyes, a trimmed beard, and a way of touching his watch chain whenever he wanted a person to remember he owned time as well as money. He managed the freight office, leased stalls at the livery, advanced credit to men who had no choice, and kept papers in a locked cabinet no one but he was allowed to open. He had been her husband's employer. He had also been the man who told Ruth, 3 days after the burial, that Daniel Bellamy's freight debt had not died with him. "Mrs. Bellamy," Prout said. "Coffee?" "Not today." He never bought anything. Men like Prout preferred to collect. Ruth kept her hands on the counter. "Then what can I do for you?" His gaze moved over the cups, the basket, the coin box half hidden beneath the plank, then settled briefly on Samuel before returning to Ruth. "I came to remind you rent is due Saturday." "I remember." "And the installment." "I remember that too." "Good. Memory is a useful habit among debtors." Jonah's face hardened. Ruth spoke before he could. "You'll have your money." "I hope so. I dislike unpleasant measures." Samuel stood silent, but Ruth could feel his attention sharpen. Prout noticed. "Mr. Vale, is it?" Samuel gave a small nod. "I trust the blacksmith shop is meeting your expectations. Mr. Larkin was always prompt with his lease." "I bought the shop from Larkin," Samuel said. "The building, yes. The ground beneath it remains tied to the livery parcel until the older deed is clarified." Samuel's expression did not change, but something in his eyes went colder. "That was not in the sale paper." "No, frontier paperwork can be troublesome." Prout smiled without warmth. "Best to let men familiar with such matters handle them." Ruth saw it then. The same tone Prout used with widows, injured men, farm wives, and anyone else he thought too tired to fight a paper they had not written. Samuel set his cup down. "I read what I sign." Most men believe they do. The words hung between them. Ruth felt the morning tilt in a way she did not like. This was no longer only about her rent. Prout turned back to her. "Saturday, Mrs. Bellamy, before noon." He tipped his hat and walked away, boots clean, coat neat, leaving unease behind him like smoke. For a while no one spoke. Jonah was the first. "I hate him." "Jonah." "I do. Hate takes more strength than he deserves. He talked to you like you were dirt. He talks to everyone that way. That doesn't improve it." Samuel looked toward the freight office at the corner. "How much?" Ruth began wiping the counter, though it was already clean. "That is not your business." "No." She looked at him. He held her gaze. "But it is a question. I owe him money." "I gathered." "My husband owed him money." "Did he?" Ruth's hand stopped on the cloth. It was not sympathy in Samuel's voice. It was not disbelief either. It was something more careful, the way a man tests a horseshoe before trusting it to hold weight. Ruth folded the cloth. "Daniel signed freight advances. Prout said the company lost goods after the shed collapsed. He said Daniel was responsible for a portion because he had taken charge of the loading." "Was your husband the foreman?" "No." "Did he own the freight?" "No." "Did you see the paper?" Ruth's mouth tightened. "He said it was not proper for me to see company records." Samuel's jaw shifted. Jonah put down the harness strap. "I told her that was wrong." "I know it's wrong," Ruth said, more sharply than she meant. "Knowing something is wrong does not make a locked cabinet open." Samuel picked up his cup again, but he did not drink. "Sometimes it does. If you know where the hinges are." Ruth stared at him. He looked at the freight office one more time, then back at her. "I'm not offering charity, Mrs. Bellamy." "Good. I'm offering to look at a door." Despite herself, despite Prout, despite rent and debt and pride, Ruth almost laughed. "You have a strange way of speaking, Samuel Vale." "I've been told." "By who?" The question came out before she could stop it. Samuel's face closed slightly. Not rude, not cold, only careful. "My sister," he said after a moment. Ruth waited, but he added nothing. It was the first personal thing he had told her. It was also clearly a door he was not ready to open, so she did not push. By mid-morning, the crowd thinned. Jonah carried the empty basket inside. Ruth counted coins beneath the counter and found the morning had been better than most. Still not enough. Never enough. She wrapped the remaining corn cakes, washed the cups, and kept hearing Prout's voice. Memory is a useful habit among debtors. When she looked up, Samuel was still across the street, hammering at the forge. Jonah stood near him, holding tongs under instruction, his face tight with concentration and something like wonder. Ruth watched for longer than she meant to. Jonah lifted the iron wrong. Samuel corrected his wrist, not by grabbing, not by scolding, but by turning his own hand slowly so Jonah could copy it. The boy adjusted. Samuel nodded once. Jonah's shoulders straightened. It was a small thing. Small things had a way of undoing Ruth. That evening, after the street emptied and the last light left the shop windows, Ruth found a folded paper beneath one of Samuel's tin cups. She opened it expecting a bill or a note about breakfast. Instead, she found 3 lines written in a plain, careful hand. "Mrs. Bellamy. Ask Prout for the original freight ledger, not the copy. If he refuses, ask why your husband's name is written in pencil. S. Vale." Ruth read it twice. Then she read it a third time. Behind her, Jonah asked, "What is it?" Ruth folded the paper slowly and looked toward the freight office, where one lamp still burned behind Prout's window. For the first time in months, the debt did not feel like a wall. It felt like a door. And somewhere in that door, as Samuel had said, there might be hinges. Ruth did not sleep much that night. She lay on the narrow bed in the small room behind the livery, listening to Jonah breathe from the cot near the stove and the horses shift in their stalls beyond the wall. The paper from Samuel Vale lay folded beneath her pillow as if it were too dangerous to leave on the table. Ask Prout for the original freight ledger, not the copy. If he refuses, ask why your husband's name is written in pencil. Those words had made a sound in her mind all evening, not loud, not wild, but steady as a hammer on iron. Ruth had never trusted a Prout. That was not new. A woman did not need a law book to know when a man enjoyed her helplessness. But not trusting him and having reason to challenge him were different things. One was a feeling. The other was a step. Steps mattered. One wrong step could cost her the rooms behind the livery, the counter beneath the awning, the right to sell coffee where travelers passed each morning. It could cost Jonah the little stability he still had. It could take the debt that was already heavy and turn it into something that swallowed them whole. Yet when Ruth closed her eyes, she saw her husband Daniel's hands. Big hands, careful hands. Hands that had tied freight ropes in rain, repaired wagon covers without being asked, and once carved Jonah a little wooden horse because the boy was too fever-weak to leave bed. Daniel had not been a careless man. He had not signed papers without understanding them. He had not taken charge of freight that was not his, and he had never used pencil where ink was needed. Before dawn, Ruth rose quietly. Jonah stirred but did not wake. She made coffee by lamplight, mixed cornmeal in a chipped bowl, and packed the cakes into the basket. Every motion was familiar. That helped. Familiar work gave fear less room. By the time she reached the awning, Mesilla Street was blue with early cold. Samuel's forge was already lit. He did not cross right away. Ruth was glad. She needed the first half hour to find her own feet beneath her. Customers came as they always did. Mr. Daly from the telegraph office. 2 stage hands. A miner with dust still in the seams of his coat. Mrs. Roscoe from the boarding house, who bought 6 corn cakes and asked 3 questions Ruth answered without answering at all. By sunrise, Jonah had taken his place on the crate, but his eyes kept sliding to Ruth's face. "You look like you're going to throw that coffee pot at somebody," he said. "Then people should behave accordingly." "I'd pay to see it." "You would not. You count worse than I do." He looked pleased at that, then looked across the street. "Mr. Vale wrote that note, didn't he?" Ruth stopped wiping a cup. Jonah lifted one shoulder. "I saw his handwriting on a nail order yesterday, same way he makes his S. You should not read other people's nail orders." "I was sorting them." "You were snooping." "I was assisting." Ruth set the cup down. "He wrote it." Jonah's expression sobered. "Are you going to ask Prute?" "Yes." "When?" Ruth looked toward the freight office. Its shutters were still closed, after the morning rush. "I'm coming." "No." "Ruth." "No." Jonah's jaw hardened in a way that made him look older than 17 and far too much like their father, who had died when Jonah was a child. "Daniel was my brother too." The word struck where Ruth had no armor. Daniel had been Ruth's husband for 6 years, but he had been Jonah's older brother long before that. After their parents died, Daniel had raised him with rough hands and patient humor. Ruth sometimes forgot that her grief was not the only grief in the room. She forgot because she had been too busy trying to keep them both fed. She softened her voice. "I know." "Then don't send me away like I'm only another thing you have to protect." The street blurred for a moment. Ruth blinked it clear. "I'm not sending you away because you're weak," she said. "I'm keeping you back because Prute likes using whatever a person loves as leverage. I won't hand him you." Jonah looked down at the strap in his lap. Across the street, Samuel stepped out of the blacksmith shop, wiping his hands on a rag. He did not approach. He only looked once at Ruth, once at the freight office, and returned inside. He was giving her space. Ruth wished that made it easier. It only made her more aware that not every man pushed when he wanted to help. At 8:30, the morning rush thinned. Ruth had sold nearly all the corn cakes. She put the remaining 3 into a cloth, covered the coffee pot, and handed Jonah the coin box. "Take this inside and lock the door." Jonah took it reluctantly. "I can stand outside." "You can lock the door." He looked ready to argue, then saw her face and obeyed. Ruth crossed the street alone. The freight office sat at the corner beside the stage yard, a square building of dark wood with 2 windows and a sign painted in careful letters, "Prute Freight and Storage." Men came in and out of it all day, carrying invoices, parcels, and worry. It smelled of dust, ink, and rope. Prute stood behind the front counter, writing in a ledger. He looked up with practiced surprise. "Mrs. Bellamy, you are early with Saturday's payment." "I didn't come with payment." His pen paused. "Then I hope you came with a proper reason." "I want to see the original freight ledger from the day Daniel died." The room changed. Not visibly. The dust still moved in the light. The clock still ticked. A clerk at the back still sorted bills beside a cabinet. But Prute's face lost its thin politeness for half a breath, and in that half breath Ruth understood Samuel's note had pointed at something real. "The ledger is company property," Prute said. "I'm named in the debt. You inherited responsibility for your husband's obligations. Then I have a right to know what those obligations are." "That is not how business works." "It is how honest business works." The clerk at the back lifted his head. Prute noticed and smiled. Grief can make a person speak rashly. Ruth kept both hands folded in front of her. "So can fear." His smile faded. She had not meant to say it quite so plainly, but once spoken, the words stood there between them and she would not call them back. Prute closed the ledger he had been writing in. "Mrs. Bellamy, your husband was responsible for a shipment of mining equipment damaged in the shed collapse. I showed you the summary. You showed me a copy. A copy prepared from official records. I want the original." "That is impossible." "Why?" "Because it is stored." "Where?" "In company storage." "Then bring it out." His fingers touched the watch chain. "I do not take orders from coffee sellers." "No," Ruth said, voice low. "You take money from them." For the first time, something like anger moved behind his pale eyes. A floorboard creaked behind her. Ruth turned. Samuel stood just inside the doorway, hat in one hand. He looked at Prut, then at Ruth, then at the clerk near the back cabinet. "I came to ask about a wagon axle shipment," Samuel said mildly. Prut's mouth tightened. "This office is occupied." "I can wait." But he did not leave. Ruth knew at once he had not come about any axle. Samuel did not step forward. He did not speak for her. He only remained where anyone in the room would have to remember there was a witness. Prut knew it too. Ruth turned back to the counter. Was Daniel's name written in pencil? The clerk dropped a stack of papers. Prut went still. It was enough. Ruth felt the answer before he gave one. "I do not know what you mean," he said. "Yes, you do. That is an insulting accusation. I asked a question, and I am finished entertaining it." He came around the counter with a set of keys in his hand, not toward the back cabinet, but toward the front door. "You will leave now. If your payment is not made by noon Saturday, I will begin eviction proceedings on the livery rooms and remove your counter from the awning. Your late husband's debt will be transferred to collection, and your brother's little repair work will not be welcome on property under my authority." Ruth's chest tightened. There it was, not hidden, not dressed in legal words. The threat plain and full. Samuel's voice came from the doorway. "Under your authority." Prut looked at him. Samuel turned his hat slowly in his hands. "You told me yesterday the ground beneath my shop was tied to the livery parcel until an older deed was clarified. Sounds like you have a wide notion of what belongs to you. I advise you to concern yourself with iron, Mr. Vale." "I do, hinges especially." Ruth saw Prut understand the meaning. His face hardened. "Get out," he said. Ruth left before Samuel could answer. Outside, the sun had risen clear over the rooftops. The street was bright now, busy enough that no one saw how Ruth's hands shook beneath her shawl. She reached the awning and found Jonah standing just inside the room door with the coin box hugged to his chest. "You asked," he said. "I asked." "What happened?" Ruth looked back at the freight office. Samuel had not come out yet. He threatened the rooms. "The counter, your repair work." Jonah's face went white with anger. "Because you asked to see a book." "Because I asked the right question." A minute later, Samuel stepped out of the freight office. He did not come straight to her. Instead, he crossed to his shop, disappeared inside, and returned carrying a paper-wrapped bundle. Only then did he approach the awning. He set the bundle on Ruth's counter. "What is that?" she asked. "Breakfast." "This is not the time." "It is exactly the time. People make poor decisions hungry." She stared at him, and despite everything, something in her almost broke into laughter or tears. She was not sure which would come first, so she did neither. Samuel lowered his voice. "You rattled him." "I also angered him." "Those are often neighbors." "He threatened Jonah." "I heard." "Then you know why this has to stop." Samuel looked toward the freight office. "It will, but not by shouting through a locked cabinet." Ruth unfolded the bundle. Inside was bread, 2 boiled eggs, and a small twist of salt. Her throat tightened again. "You feed people oddly." "I learned from a woman across the street." Jonah looked between them, then took one of the eggs. "I like him." Ruth shot him a look. Jonah bit into the egg and spoke with his mouth half full. "Still true." Samuel almost smiled. Then his face became serious. "Prut keeps 2 ledgers. I saw the clerk reach for the right cabinet before Prut stopped him. The original may still be there." "How does that help if he won't show it?" "Because he has to file monthly freight abstracts with the territorial agent in El Paso. Copies of totals, names, shipments, losses." "Would those show pencil?" "No, but they might show whether Daniel's supposed debt existed before he died or appeared after." Ruth went quiet. The idea was simple, terrifyingly simple. If Pruitt had written Daniel's name after the accident, the monthly abstracts might betray him. Numbers filed before a death could not easily be changed after it, not if someone else held copies. How long would it take to get them? She asked. By letter, weeks. By stage to El Paso, 4 days there and back if connections are kind. Longer if they are. I can't leave. I can. No. The word came too quickly. Samuel looked at her. Ruth felt heat rise in her face, not from embarrassment but fear. I mean, you have your shop, your work, you just bought it. I did. You don't know me. I know enough. No, you know coffee and corn cakes and a debt you think smells wrong. That is not enough to leave your business for days. Samuel was quiet a moment. Then he said, My sister said that to me once. Ruth's anger softened before she could stop it. He looked down at his scarred wrist. Not those words, but near enough. What happened to her? The question stood bare between them. For a long moment, Ruth thought he would close the door again. She would not have blamed him. Everyone had rooms inside themselves where light hurt. But Samuel looked toward his shop, where the forge glowed low and steady. She signed a boarding house contract in Socorro, he said. Man who held it kept adding charges she couldn't read. Laundry fees, damage fees, food fees. By the time she wrote me, she believed she owed more than she could earn in a year. I rode there angry and stupid, thinking anger was a tool. Ruth did not move. It wasn't, he said. By the time I understood paper mattered more than fists, she'd left town with a family heading west. I found her months later. Fever took her outside Tucson. I'm sorry, Ruth whispered. Samuel nodded once, accepting it without reaching for comfort he had not asked for. That is why I read what I sign, he said, and why I notice when men use papers like locked doors. Ruth looked at him then, truly looked, and understood that his quiet was not emptiness. It was a place where pain had settled and become discipline. I can't pay you to go to El Paso, she said. I didn't ask. And I won't owe you. You won't. Then what is it? Samuel's eyes met hers. A trade. For what? You let Jonah spend mornings in the shop when he wants. I need a careful hand for small work. Hinges, rivets, tack repairs. I'll pay him fair. Jonah froze with the egg still in his hand. Ruth saw the boy's face change, hope breaking through so suddenly it hurt to witness. Samuel, she said softly. It's work, he said, not charity. Ruth looked at Jonah. He tried to keep his expression calm, failed completely. And there, beneath the livery awning on an ordinary bright morning, Ruth felt another hinge shift in a door she had thought would never open. All right, she said. Jonah let out a breath that sounded like he had been holding it for a year. Samuel nodded. Then I'll write to a man I know in El Paso first. If he can get the abstracts without my going, he will. If not, I'll ride. Ruth folded the breakfast paper carefully, though it was only paper. Across the street, Asap Pruitt stood in the freight office window watching them. Ruth saw him. Samuel saw him too. This time, Ruth did not look away first. By Saturday morning, Ruth had counted the rent stack 6 times and the installment stack 4. Counting did not make the coins multiply. It only made the shortage more honest. She had the rent in full. That much she had managed by selling extra coffee to 2 freight hands, repairing Mrs. Roscoe's torn tablecloth for 10 cents, and going without fresh lamp oil for 3 nights. But the installment on Daniel's supposed debt still sat 38 cents short, even after Jonah added everything he had earned mending straps. He had placed his coins on the table the night before without a word. Ruth had pushed them back. Jonah had pushed them toward her again. It's our debt. It is not yours. Daniel was my brother. And I am the one Pruitt comes to. Because he knows you'll stand there and take it. Ruth had looked at him then, not angry, only tired. Do you think that is what I do? Jonah's face changed at once. He was still young enough for regret to show quickly. No, he said, I didn't mean it. I know. I just hate that he can make you count pennies like they're sins. Ruth had sat down across from him. The room was small, the stove giving off its last heat, the night pressing black against the window. Pennies are not sins, they are just pennies, and tomorrow I will give him what I have and ask for time on the rest. He won't give it. No. Then why ask? Because I want him to refuse in front of witnesses. Jonah had stared at her. You're getting dangerous. I'm getting tired. Those were different things, but sometimes they stood close enough to cast the same shadow. Now, beneath the livery awning, Ruth poured coffee while the town moved through its ordinary Saturday. Saturdays in Las Cruces were always louder. Ranch wives came in for supplies. Miners spent money too quickly. Children ran near wagon wheels and were shouted back by mothers with full arms. Men from the South Road brought dust with them. Men from the North Road brought news. And everyone wanted coffee because coffee gave a person something to hold while listening. Samuel crossed the street at the usual hour with 2 cups. He did not ask whether she had slept. He knew she had not. Instead, he set 1 cup beside her elbow and placed a small cloth bundle on the counter. Biscuits. I sell corn cakes. These are not for selling. Ruth looked at him. Do you plan to feed me every morning until I become too heavy to run from my troubles? No, just until you stop thinking hunger proves virtue. Jonah, seated with a strip of bridal leather across his lap, made a strangled sound that might have been a laugh. Ruth took the coffee because refusing it would have required more strength than accepting it. The first sip steadied her. She hated needing it. She was grateful for it anyway. Any word from El Paso? She asked. Samuel shook his head. Not yet. I sent a wire yesterday through Daily asking if my letter was received. Reply should come today or Monday. A wire cost money. Ruth knew that. She looked at him. He answered before she spoke. Shop expense. That is not a shop expense. It concerns a hinge. Samuel. He leaned one hand on the counter and lowered his voice. If the abstracts prove that debt was written after Daniel died, Prout loses more than a payment. He loses the way people see him. He knows it. Today he may press hard. I know. I'll be across the street. I know that too. There was comfort in it, and that frightened her more than the warning. For months after Daniel's death, people had said kind things. They had brought soup, old blankets, half sacks of potatoes, prayers wrapped in awkward voices. Ruth had appreciated each one. But kindness that arrived and left was different from a presence that stayed close enough to be counted on. She was not sure what to do with a steady thing. At 11, Prout came. He came not alone, which Ruth had expected, but with Deputy Harlan Mace walking beside him. Mace was not a cruel man, but he was a small one in spirit, and small men often found safety standing next to larger shadows. He wore his badge polished bright and his mustache trimmed sharp, and he looked uncomfortable before anyone spoke. The crowd around Ruth's counter thinned without leaving. That was how towns watched trouble. They made room for it, then pretended they had not stopped to see. Prout held a black ledger under one arm, not the freight ledger, his own collection book. Mrs. Bellamy, he said. Mr. Prout. I have come for rent and installment. Ruth bent, lifted the 2 coin stacks from the box, and placed them on the counter separately. Rent in full. Installment short by 38 cents. I'll have the rest by Tuesday. Prout looked at the coins as if they were something unpleasant found in a clean room. The agreement says Saturday before noon. The agreement I have never been allowed to read. A murmur passed through the waiting customers. Deputy Mace shifted his weight. Prout's eyes sharpened. This again. Yes, Ruth said, this again. I told you the records are not available for public handling. I am not the public. I am the widow of the man whose name you used. Prout laid the collection book on the counter. The name was signed. In pencil. The murmur grew louder. Prout's gaze flicked around the awning. He had expected fear. He had not expected an audience bold enough to breathe. The debt stands, he said, and as payment is incomplete, I am within my rights to begin removal. Removal of what? Your counter, your rooms, Any use of livery frontage for unauthorized trade. Ruth kept her voice calm, though her pulse beat hard in her ears. You have taken rent for this counter every week since December. As a courtesy, I have receipts. Temporary receipts. You wrote them. I manage the parcel. Samuel's voice came from the edge of the crowd. Do you own it? Prut turned. Samuel stood beside a hitching post, sleeves rolled, hammer still hanging from the loop at his belt. He had not pushed through. He had not made a show of himself. He was simply there like the weight of iron no one could ignore. Prut smiled thinly. Mr. Vale. Always near when legal matters exceed your trade. Ownership is not a legal matter beyond most trades. Deputy Mace cleared his throat. Maybe we ought to keep this civil. Civil is all I have been, Prut said. Mrs. Bellamy has chosen to invite gossip into business. Ruth picked up one of the rent receipts and laid it flat on the counter. Her hands had stopped shaking now. That surprised her. This receipt says rent for livery rooms and awning counter. It is dated last Saturday. It bears your signature. Prut looked at it, then at her. And as I said, temporary. For how long? As long as I allow. On what authority? His smile vanished. There it was again. The hinge. Ruth did not know enough to open the door, but she knew now where to press. The deputy glanced at Prut. Asa, do you have the parcel paper with you? Prut's head turned slowly. The what? The parcel paper. If you're asking me to help remove a widow from rooms and frontage, I'd like to know the authority is clear. The crowd went very still. Ruth looked at Deputy Mace with new eyes. Perhaps he was small in spirit. Perhaps he was also not quite as small as she had believed. Prut's voice cooled. I did not bring deeds to collect a simple debt. Then maybe removal waits until you do. Prut stared at him. Samuel said nothing. Ruth said nothing. Jonah, behind the counter, looked as if he had just discovered the world could tilt in his favor for once. Prut closed his collection book. He reached for the rent coins and the partial installment. Ruth placed her hand over the installment stack. His eyes lifted. You can have the rent, she said. I will keep the installment until I see the original paper. You refuse payment. I refuse to pay a debt you will not prove. Someone in the crowd whispered, good. Prut heard it. Everyone heard it. The first red touched his neck above his collar. You are making a foolish mistake. No, Ruth said. I made the mistake when I let shame keep me from asking sooner. Prut leaned closer. His voice dropped, but not enough. Women alone in this town survive by knowing who not to anger. Ruth held his gaze. Then men in this town ought to survive by knowing who not to cheat. The words left her before fear could stop them. For one breath, no one moved. Then Mrs. Roscoe from the boarding house stepped forward, set 3 cents on the counter and said, coffee, please. It was such an ordinary thing that it broke the spell. A miner followed. Then Mr. Daly. Then 2 teamsters. Coins rang against the counter. Cups moved. People stepped between Ruth and Prut, not with fists, not with shouting, but with business, with choice, with the simple act of standing where he wanted emptiness. Prut looked at the crowd as if seeing each face stored away for later. Then he took only the rent coins, turned, and walked back toward the freight office with Deputy Mace beside him. Ruth poured coffee until the pot ran dry. Only after the last customer left did she sit down. Her knees had gone weak. Jonah came to her side. You did it. I did something. You scared him. No, Ruth watched Prut disappear into his office. I embarrassed him. That can be more dangerous. Samuel crossed the street then. He brought no food this time, no second cup. He only came near enough for his shadow to touch the edge of her counter. You held steady, he said. I wanted to run. Most steady people do. Ruth looked at him. Did you know the deputy would ask for the parcel paper? No. Did you hope? Yes. She breathed out slowly. I don't like hope. It makes promises it may not keep. Samuel's face softened. Then don't call it hope. Call it evidence that not every door is locked. Jonah leaned on the counter. Some are just stuck. Samuel looked at him. Exactly. For the first time that day, Ruth smiled. It did not last long, but it was real. That afternoon, Jonah went to the blacksmith shop for his first paid work. Ruth watched from the awning as Samuel showed him how to sort small hinges by wear, not size, and how to tell which ones could be saved with careful filing. Jonah listened as if the knowledge were water after a long, dry spell. Near sunset, Mr. Daly from the telegraph office came down the street with an envelope in hand. "Wire for Mr. Vale," he called. Samuel stepped out of the shop and took it. Ruth stood behind her counter, wiping the same cup again and again. Samuel read the message once, then again. His eyes lifted to Ruth across the road. She knew before he crossed that the news had weight. He handed her the telegram without speaking. Ruth read it slowly, the printed words uneven but clear. Found abstract copies. Bllamy det absent month before accident, appears month after, original may have been altered. Will send certified copies by stage. She did not move. The street around her seemed to grow bright and distant at the same time. Daniel's debt had not existed before he died. It had appeared after. Jonah came out of the shop, saw her face, and limped quickly across the road. Ruth. She handed him the telegram. He read it, and the boy who had tried so hard to be useful, so hard to be grown, covered his mouth with one hand. Samuel stood beside them quietly. Ruth looked toward the freight office. Prute's lamp was already lit, though dusk had not fully settled. For months, that lamp had felt like an eye watching her. Now it looked like a man sitting alone with a lie that had finally begun to rot. Ruth folded the telegram carefully and placed it in her apron pocket. "What now?" Jonah asked. Ruth looked at Samuel. Samuel looked back, steady as the forge behind him. "Now," she said, "we ask for the ledger again." Ruth did not go to the freight office that evening. She wanted to. The want came sharp and hot, the kind that made a person imagine walking across the street, putting the telegram on a Prute's desk, and watching his face understand that the lie had been dragged into daylight. But Samuel stopped her without touching her. "Not tonight," he said. Ruth stood beneath the awning with the telegram folded in her apron pocket, the last wash water cooling in the basin. Jonah still holding one of the certified copy promises like it might disappear if he let go. "Why not?" she asked. "Because he will be ready for anger." "I am not angry." Samuel looked at her. "All right," she said, "I am angry." He knows how to handle angry people. He'll call it grief, confusion, womanly upset, anything that makes the truth sound smaller. Tomorrow morning with witnesses, you ask again. Calmly. "I was calm today." "You were." "I can be calm tonight." "You can," Samuel said, "but there will be no one to see him refuse." That was the kind of answer Ruth hated most, because it was right. Across the street, Prute's office lamp burned yellow behind the window. A figure moved inside once, then vanished. Ruth could imagine him at his desk, sorting papers, hiding papers, destroying papers. Her fingers curled around the edge of the counter. "What if he burns it?" she asked. "The original ledger." "Yes." "Then he explains why the one paper that could clear him turned to ash after you asked for it twice. Men like Prute always have explanations." "And now," Samuel said quietly, "you have dates." Ruth took out the telegram again and unfolded it. The words had not changed. Absent month before accident, appears month after. For a long time she had lived beneath a debt as if it had been written into the bones of the earth. Daniel owed, therefore Ruth owed. Prute said it, and papers somewhere proved it, and all she could do was pour coffee until her hands ached enough to satisfy a dead man's burden. Now the burden had a seam. She folded the telegram and pressed it flat against her palm. "Tomorrow, then." "Tomorrow." Jonah, who had been quiet too long, looked at Samuel. "Should we tell Deputy Mace?" "In the morning," Samuel said. "Not before Prute has a chance to show what he intends." Ruth frowned. "That sounds like setting a trap." "No, It is giving a man room to choose the truth. And if he does not, then he chooses in front of witnesses. That night, Ruth put the telegram inside Daniel's old Bible, between the pages where he had once kept a pressed desert flower from their first spring in Las Cruces. She did not open to that page often. Grief had a way of making even sweet things hurt at the edges, but that night she looked at the little pale flower and touched it with one finger. "I should have asked sooner," she whispered. Jonah stood near the stove, his boot unbuttoned, his face solemn. He would not say that. Ruth turned. "Daniel," Jonah said, "he would not blame you for believing a man with papers when you were burying your husband." Ruth sat slowly on the bed. Jonah looked embarrassed by his own tenderness and bent to fix the stove door, though it did not need fixing. "He'd be mad at Prut, not you." Ruth swallowed. For a moment, the room was filled with Daniel as he had been, laughing with flour on his sleeves, lifting Jonah onto a mule despite Ruth warning both of them it was foolish, bringing home 3 bruised apples because the seller was going to throw them out, and Daniel said sweetness ought not be wasted. She had tried so hard not to lose him that she had made a job of paying a debt in his name, as if clearing it would keep some part of his honor safe. Now she feared the debt had never been his at all. The thought did not bring relief first. It brought sorrow, because if Daniel had been used after death, then Ruth had spent months feeding a lie with her labor. Jonah limped over and sat beside her. Neither spoke. Outside, the horses shifted behind the wall, and somewhere beyond town a dog barked twice. At dawn, Ruth set out the coffee counter as usual. She did not wear her morning black. She had worn it every day since Daniel's funeral until it faded brown at the seams. That morning she put on a dark blue dress she had mended carefully the week before, plain but clean, with a white collar she had scrubbed by lamplight. Jonah noticed at once. "You look like Sunday," he said. "I look like Thursday with better buttons." "It's Saturday." "Then I am ahead." He smiled, but his eyes were nervous. Samuel crossed the street at 5:30, carrying his 2 cups. This time he brought no pan, no bread, no biscuits, only coffee, poured from Ruth's own pot in one small folded cloth. "What is that?" Ruth asked. "A clean handkerchief." "I have one." "I know." "Then why bring it?" "In case yours is busy pretending not to be needed." She looked at him for a long moment, then accepted it. Their fingers touched briefly. The contact was nothing, a small brush of skin over cloth. Yet Ruth felt it with ridiculous clarity, as if the morning had narrowed to that one point. Samuel seemed to feel it too, because he looked down at his hand before he stepped back. Jonah watched both of them with the careful silence of someone gathering material for later. "Do not," Ruth told him. "I said nothing." "Continue." Customers came early, and word had plainly moved faster than wagons. People who did not usually buy morning coffee appeared beneath the awning with coins ready. Mrs. Roscoe bought 2 cups, though she lived close enough to make her own. Mr. Daly came and lingered. A miner named Ellis bought a corn cake and forgot to eat it. Deputy Mace walked by once, then returned and stood near the hitching rail, pretending to inspect a loose buckle. At 9, Ruth crossed to the freight office. This time she did not go alone. Samuel walked behind her, far enough not to claim the matter, near enough that no one could pretend she had slipped quietly into a room where words could be rearranged later. Jonah stayed at the counter, though every line of him wanted to follow. Prut was behind his desk when she entered. The clerk, a young man named Willard Finch, stood at the rear cabinet with a stack of folded invoices. His face paled when he saw Ruth. That told her something too. Prut did not rise. "Mrs. Bellamy." "Mr. Prut, if this concerns your refusal to make full payment." "It concerns the original freight ledger." His eyes moved to Samuel, then back to her. "We have discussed this." "No, you have refused it. We have not discussed it." Samuel remained near the door, hat in hand, silent. Prut's voice hardened. "The ledger is not available." "Then I would like you to say, in front of Mr. Vale and anyone else who can hear, That you refuse to show the original entry of a debt you claim I owe. Prout stood. You are becoming troublesome. I am becoming precise. The clerk's mouth tightened as if holding back a breath. Ruth saw it and turned to him. Mr. Finch, you were working here when my husband died. What? Willard looked at Prout. Prout said, my clerk is not part of this conversation. Ruth kept her eyes on Willard. Were you? Willard swallowed. Yes, ma'am. Did you enter Daniel Bellamy's debt in the ledger? No, ma'am. The room went silent. Prout stepped around the desk. Finch. Willard's hands shook around the invoices. I didn't. I remember because Mr. Bellamy's name was not on the loss sheet first. It came later. Prout's face darkened. You are mistaken. Willard looked at the floor. Ruth's heart pounded so hard she felt it in her throat. Who entered it? Willard did not answer. Prout spoke first. Enough. He crossed to the front door, opened it wide and pointed out. Leave this office. His mistake was opening the door. The street was not empty. Mrs. Roscoe stood outside with her coffee cup. Mr. Daly stood beside her. Deputy Mace was near the hitching rail. 3 freight hands were across the road. Jonah stood behind the coffee counter with both hands pressed to the plank. They had heard enough. Deputy Mace took a step forward. Asa, maybe it's time to bring out the ledger. Prout looked at the gathered faces, and for the first time his composure broke in a way no polite word could mend. This is a private business matter. Not if you're asking me to enforce it, Mace said. Prout's gaze snapped to Ruth. You think a few whispers and a frightened clerk will undo a signed obligation. Ruth took the telegram from her pocket. She did not unfold it dramatically. She did not raise her voice. She simply opened it and placed it on the desk. Copies of the territorial freight abstracts are being sent from El Paso, she said. They show Daniel's debt did not exist the month before he died. It appeared the month after. Willard shut his eyes. Deputy Mace entered the office fully now. Is that true? Prout looked at the telegram without touching it. Abstracts can be incomplete. Then the original ledger will clear it. Prout said nothing. Samuel looked toward the rear cabinet. Ruth followed his gaze, so did Deputy Mace. The cabinet was oak, tall and narrow, with 2 locked doors. Prout's keys hung from a chain at his waist. Open it, Mace said. Prout laughed once, dry and sharp. On what authority? On the authority that I am refusing to remove Mrs. Bellamy from anything until I see the paper you claim gives cause. And if you want court backing, we can walk to Judge Whitcomb now and explain why you won't show it. The name changed the air again. Judge Whitcomb was old, slow-moving, half-deaf in one ear, and impossible to hurry. He was also known to dislike hidden papers almost as much as he disliked unpaid taxes. Prout understood what that meant. For a moment, Ruth thought he would still refuse. Then he took the keys from his waist. The small sound of metal against metal carried through the room. He unlocked the cabinet and pulled out a ledger bound in cracked brown leather. It looked ordinary. That was what struck Ruth most. This ordinary book had ruled her life for months. Prout placed it on the desk. Deputy Mace stepped closer. Open to the accident date. Prout did not move. Willard whispered, January 17th. All eyes turned to him. He flushed but continued. The shed collapsed January 17th. Deputy Mace opened the ledger himself. Ruth could not breathe. Samuel stood beside her now, not touching her, close enough that she knew if her knees failed, the fall would not be far. The deputy turned pages slowly. Freight entries, payments, losses, names, ink in black, brown, faded blue. Then January 17th. There was Daniel's name. Ruth saw it from where she stood. D. Bellamy, equipment loss liability, £18 and 6 shillings. For a second the amount itself blurred. £18 and 6 shillings was more than a debt. It was a year of mournings. It was worn shoes, thin soup, Jonah's medicine stretched too far, Ruth's back bent over a counter in the cold. Then Samuel leaned slightly forward. Look at the line above it, he said. The deputy bent closer. Ruth did too. The line above Daniel's name had been written in ink. The line below also ink. Daniel's line was darker in places and gray in others. Pencil traced later with ink. Worse than that, the spacing was wrong. The January 17th page had been full once. Someone had squeezed Daniel's name between two entries, the letters narrow, cramped, pressed into a place where they had not belonged. The room held its breath. Deputy Mace looked at Prout. "Who wrote this?" Prout's face had gone smooth, too smooth. "I do not recall." Willard spoke so softly, Ruth barely heard him. "You did." Prout turned on him, careful. But Willard was staring at the ledger now, as if the book had frightened him for longer than anyone knew. "You told me to sharpen the pencil," he said. "You said there wasn't room to spoil the page with ink first. You said Mr. Bellamy had agreed before he died, and the papers only needed catching up." Ruth gripped the edge of the desk. Samuel's hand hovered near her elbow but did not take it. "Willard," Prout said, voice low, "you are a clerk with a widowed mother in a rented house." The threat was clear. Willard looked terrified. Then Mrs. Roscoe's voice came from the doorway. "His mother can take my east room if need be." Mr. Daly added, "Telegraph office needs a copy hand." A freight worker said, "And Prout ain't the only man hires clerks." One by one, ordinary people turned a threat into a smaller thing. Willard's shoulders loosened by a fraction. Deputy Mace closed the ledger carefully, keeping one finger between the pages. "I'm taking this to Judge Whitcomb." Prout stepped forward. "You will do no such thing." "I will. That ledger is company property. It is evidence in an attempted unlawful collection." The words sounded too large for the little office, but they fit. Prout looked at Ruth then, and the hatred in his face was calm enough to chill her. "This is not finished." For months those words would have bent her. That morning they did not. "No," Ruth said, "but it has started." Deputy Mace lifted the ledger and walked out. The gathered crowd parted for him. Ruth followed more slowly. Outside, the sun had risen high enough to turn the dusk gold beneath the wagon wheels. Jonah came across the road toward her but stopped halfway when he saw her face. "Ruth?" he asked. She tried to answer. Nothing came. Then the truth reached her fully. Daniel had not owed the debt. He had not left her that burden. He had not failed her. The sound that came out of Ruth was small, broken, and nothing like the strong voice she used to sell coffee. She pressed Samuel's handkerchief to her mouth and turned away from the street, but the tears came anyway. Samuel stood beside her, shielding without crowding. Jonah reached her then and took her free hand. "I told you," he whispered, though his own voice shook. "Daniel would be mad at him, not you." Ruth laughed and cried at once, which made no graceful sound at all. Across the street, Asap Prout stood in the freight office doorway, watching the town gather around the woman he had expected to stand alone. For the first time since Daniel died, Ruth did not feel like a widow paying for a dead man's mistake. She felt like a woman who had been lied to, and that was painful, but it was also clean. Judge Whitcomb did not move quickly for any man, and he moved even slower when a whole street seemed to be waiting on him. By noon, the brown freight ledger sat on his desk inside the little courthouse at the end of Mesilla Street. Deputy Mace had carried it there himself, one hand pressed flat against the cover as though the book might leap free and run back to Asap Prout if given a chance. Ruth had gone too, with Jonah on one side and Samuel on the other. She had not meant to go all the way inside. Her strength had thinned after the ledger opened, and the tears she had held back for months had left her hollow. But when the deputy asked if she wanted to be present while the judge examined the page, Ruth heard herself say yes before fear could speak for her. She had spent too long being told what papers meant after other people had read them. She would not wait outside another door. Judge Whitcomb was a heavy-shouldered man with white hair that curled around his ears and spectacles that seemed always near the end of his nose. He listened without expression while Deputy Mace explained the matter. Then he opened the ledger and bent over the January 17th page. No one spoke. The room smelled of old wood, dust, and ink. A clock ticked above a shelf of law books. Outside, wagon wheels passed in the street, ordinary life continuing with no understanding that Ruth Bellamy's world was being unstitched and sewn again inside that room. Judge Whitcomb took a small glass from his drawer and held it over Daniel's name. He said. Ruth had never hated a sound more. He turned the page back, then forward. He looked at the binding. He looked at the edges of the paper. He studied the line above Daniel's name and the line below it. Then he ran one thick finger near the writing without touching it. At last, he looked over his spectacles at Deputy Mace. "You said the territorial abstracts show no such debt in the prior month." "Telegram says certified copies are coming by stage," Mace answered. "When?" "Monday, if the roads stay clear." Judge Whitcomb nodded slowly. "Until those arrive, I will hold the ledger." Ruth let out a breath. "Can he still remove us?" Jonah asked. Ruth turned to him, surprised by the force in his voice. The judge looked at the boy, not unkindly, from the livery rooms. "Yes, sir, and the coffee counter." "On what lease?" Jonah faltered. Ruth said, "Mr. Prout claims he manages the livery parcel and can revoke permission." "Claims?" Judge Whitcomb repeated, as if the word had a sour taste. He looked at Deputy Mace. "Has he shown deed or management authority?" "No, sir." The judge sat back. His chair complained beneath him. "Then until he does, no removal, no seizure of goods, no interference with trade already paid through the week. If Prout dislikes that, he may bring me the deed instead of his temper." The words were plain, not dramatic, not soft, but Ruth felt them settle inside her like a beam set properly under a sagging roof. No removal, no seizure, no interference. For the first time in months, she knew where she would sleep that night because the law had said so, not because Asaph Prout had allowed it. "Thank you," Ruth said. Judge Whitcomb looked at her over the ledger. "Don't thank me yet. A false debt is one matter. A forged or altered company ledger is another, and a man cornered by papers may begin looking for fire." Samuel's eyes sharpened. The judge closed the ledger and placed both hands on it. "Deputy, you will ask Mr. Prout to surrender any related copies, invoices, lost sheets, and correspondence concerning the Bellamy accident. Ask politely once. If he refuses, come back for a warrant." "Yes, sir." "And Mrs. Bellamy." Ruth straightened. "Do not keep your important papers in your room behind a livery." She thought of the telegram tucked back inside Daniel's Bible, behind a wall that smelled of hay and lamp smoke. "No, sir." "Give them to someone who owns a lock Prout cannot touch." Samuel spoke quietly. "My shop has an iron safe. Mr. Larkin left it." The judge looked at him. "Does it lock?" "Yes, sir." "Does Prout hold any key to that shop?" "No, sir." "Then use it." Ruth did not argue. Some pride was strength. Some pride was just fear wearing a Sunday hat. When they left the courthouse, the sun had shifted westward and the street had changed around them. Not in its buildings or dust or noise, in the eyes. People looked at Ruth differently now. Some with pity, which she disliked. Some with respect, which she did not know what to do with. Some with shame, perhaps remembering how many times they had watched her pay a debt without asking whether it was real. Mrs. Roscoe was waiting near the steps. "I made stew," she said. "Too much." Ruth opened her mouth. Mrs. Roscoe lifted a hand. "Do not insult us both by calling it charity. My boarders eat like field hands and complain like bankers. Take the pot when you close." Ruth's throat tightened. "Thank you." Mr. Daly came next, holding his hat. "If you need telegrams sent regarding the matter, I can delay billing until the end of the month." "That is kind." "It is practical," he said, though his ears reddened. "A freight hand named Ellis offered to carry water for the coffee stand in the mornings. The baker's wife said she could spare yesterday's rolls cheap." Deputy Mace said nothing kind at all, but he walked Ruth back to the awning before heading toward Prout's office, and that was better than words. By the time Ruth reached her counter, she felt unsteady beneath the weight of help. Help, she was discovering, could feel heavy when a person was used to carrying everything alone. Jonah noticed first. He always did. "You're going pale," he said. "I am not." "You are, Sid." "I have to wash cups." "I can wash cups." "You dislike washing cups." "I dislike Prut more." Samuel stepped behind the counter without asking and lifted the wash basin. "Where do you want this?" Ruth stared at him. "You cannot simply come behind my counter." "I just did." "It is my counter." "Yes." "And I decide who works it." "Yes." "Then I have not decided." Samuel looked at the basin, then at her. "Decide quickly. This water is cold." Jonah laughed. It broke something in the air. Ruth sat before she could make a new argument. Samuel took the basin to the pump. Jonah gathered cups. Ruth watched them move around her little business as if they belonged there, and the sight put an ache under her ribs she could not name. For nearly a year she had measured her worth by how little she needed. Need less, oh less. Oh less, be safer. Be safer, survive. But surviving had made her lonely in ways she had not let herself admit. When Samuel returned with fresh water, she said, "You do not have to stay." "I know. You have work." "Yes." "You keep leaving it." Jonah sorted my hinge box better than I ever did. Shop S improved already. Jonah looked up from the cups, startled and pleased. Ruth saw it and softened. He likes order. I noticed. The afternoon passed strangely. News spread, but no one said too much directly. Customers came and bought more than they needed. Some lingered near the awning as though Ruth might be swept away if enough people did not keep watch. Prut did not appear. That worried Samuel. Ruth could tell by the way he glanced toward the freight office every few minutes. The office door remained closed. The windows were shuttered, though the day was warm. Once, Willard Finch came out carrying a sealed envelope and walked quickly toward the telegraph office with his head down. Samuel saw that too. At 3, Deputy Mace returned from Prut's office without papers. Ruth stood, "Well." Mace removed his hat and wiped his forehead with his sleeve. He refused to surrender anything. "Of course he did," Jonah muttered. "He says the Bellamy matter is being misrepresented, that the ledger was corrected according to verbal authorization from Daniel before his death, and that any supporting documents are private freight property." Ruth felt the old anger rise, but it came colder now. Daniel cannot answer him. "No," Mace said, "which is why Judge Whitcomb is writing a warrant." Samuel's face remained still. "When will it be served?" "Before dusk." "Then he has time." Mace looked at him. "To do what?" Samuel's gaze moved to the freight office shutters. "Whatever he thinks papers can't survive." Deputy Mace swore under his breath and turned back toward the courthouse. Ruth's hands went cold. Fire. Judge Whitcomb had said it as warning. Now it seemed less like warning and more like weather on the horizon. Samuel stepped closer. "Get your papers." Ruth did not ask which papers. She went to the room behind the livery with Jonah close behind. Daniel's Bible lay beneath the bed wrapped in cloth. She pulled it out and opened to the pressed flower. The telegram was still there. So were the rent receipts she had tucked beside it and the small bundle of notes she had made about every payment to Prut since December. She added the only photograph she had of Daniel because she could not bear to leave it, though it proved nothing to anyone but her. Jonah gathered his few repair receipts and the little notebook where he wrote down harness work. "Will he come here?" he asked. "I don't know." Ruth hated that answer. They carried everything across the street to Samuel's shop. The blacksmith shop was warmer than the day outside. It smelled of coal smoke, iron, leather, and clean water. The forge glowed low, banked but alive. Against the rear wall stood the iron safe Mr. Larkin had left behind, squat and dark, with a wheel handle and a key Samuel wore on a cord beneath his shirt. Samuel opened it. Inside were shop papers, bills of sale, a small roll of cash, and a folded piece of cloth. Ruth did not look at the cloth long, but she saw enough to know it held something personal. A woman's ribbon, perhaps. A letter, something of his sister. Samuel moved his own papers aside and made room. Ruth placed Daniel's Bible inside. For a moment her hand rested on the cover. Samuel did not hurry her. When the safe door closed, the sound was final. Ruth felt both safer and strangely bereft. That Bible had sat in her room since Daniel died. Moving it felt like admitting the room itself could not protect what mattered. At dusk, Judge Whitcomb's warrant was ready. Deputy Mace took 2 men and crossed to the freight office. Ruth stood beneath Samuel's awning, not hers, watching through the dimming light. Several townspeople gathered, quieter now. Even the horses seemed to sense the change. Mace knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. At last he tried the door, locked. One of the men went around back. A minute later he shouted. Samuel moved before Ruth understood why. He crossed the street fast, Ruth and Jonah following despite his look telling them not to. Behind the freight office near the storage shed, thin smoke curled from a stovepipe that should have been cold. Mace forced the rear door open. A breath of smoke rolled out. Not flames yet. Smoke. Paper smoke. Men rushed in with buckets from the pump. Samuel covered his mouth with his sleeve and went through the back door after Mace. Ruth grabbed Jonah's arm when he tried to follow. No. But. No. They waited in the alley, smoke drifting into the purple evening, Ruth's heart beating so hard she felt sick. Then Samuel came out carrying a metal cash box blackened along one side. Mace followed with a stack of scorched papers pressed under his coat. Behind them, one of the men shouted that the stove was out. Samuel set the cash box on the ground and coughed hard. Ruth reached for him without thinking, her hand closing around his arm. He looked down at her hand. She did not let go. "What is it?" she asked. Mace held up the scorched papers. Lost sheets, some burned, some not. Samuel knelt by the cash box. This was under the stove. "Locked?" Ruth asked. Samuel touched the lid. Was. The heat had warped the latch enough for him to pry it open with a flat tool from his belt. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were letters, receipts, and 3 folded contracts. Deputy Mace bent close with the fading light. One paper, browned at the edge but readable, bore Daniel's name, not his signature. His name written by someone else at the top of a blank liability form. Ruth knew it at once, a paper prepared before the lie had been finished. Mace exhaled. "Well, Asa, what did you do?" Ruth looked toward the street. "Where is he?" No one answered. The freight office was empty. Pruitt had burned what he could and left before the warrant came. For a moment fear tried to return in its old shape. A man who fled might come back in some worse manner. A man losing control might strike at whatever he could still reach. Then Samuel stood beside her, smoke on his shirt, soot along his jaw, the cash box at his feet and truth rising out of it piece by piece. "He ran," Jonah said. Ruth looked at the smoke, the open door, the ruined quiet of Pruitt's office. "No," she said softly. "He showed us where the rest of the truth was hidden." Samuel looked at her then, and something like pride moved in his tired eyes. The first stars appeared over Las Cruces while Deputy Mace gathered the saved papers. People carried buckets, opened windows, spoke in low voices. Someone brought water for Samuel. Mrs. Roscoe wrapped a shawl around Ruth's shoulders without asking. Across the street, Ruth's coffee counter stood empty beneath the livery awning. For the first time she saw how small it was. Not worthless. Never that. But small compared to the number of people now standing around it, ready to help hold up what Pruitt had tried to burn down. And somewhere inside Samuel Vale's iron safe, Daniel's Bible rested behind a locked door, no longer alone in the dark. By morning, Asa Pruitt was gone from Las Cruces. No one saw him leave, or at least no one admitted to seeing it plainly. A few people heard wheels late in the night. The stable boy at the south end said one of Pruitt's better horses was missing from its stall. Mr. Daly at the telegraph office said a message had been sent after dark to a man in El Paso, but he would not repeat the words without Judge Whitcomb's order. By 6, half the town had already decided Pruitt had run to Mexico. By 7, the other half had decided he was hiding close enough to come back. Ruth believed neither rumor fully. Men like a saproot did not simply vanish because shame found them. They moved where their papers went. They protected money first, then reputation, then pride, and only after all that did they think of anything like justice. If Prude had left, he had left with a purpose. That thought stayed with Ruth while she opened the coffee counter beneath the livery awning. Her hands moved through the familiar order. Cups, pot, cloth, basket, coin box. The morning was cool and clear, with a pale line of gold rising behind the low roofs and the Organ Mountains still dark against the sky. Nothing about the street should have felt different. The dust lay in the same wheel ruts. The horses snorted in the same stalls. The stage office door still stuck halfway open when the clerk shoved it with his shoulder. But everything was different. People crossed the street to speak to her now. Not in pity exactly, though some had not yet learned the difference. They asked after Jonah. They asked whether Judge Whitcomb had said more. They asked if she needed help carrying water, finding flour, locking her room, watching the counter. Ruth answered each one carefully. "Thank you. We are all right. I'll let you know." Those words became a fence around her. Polite, useful, necessary. Because if she allowed every offer inside at once, she might sit down in the street and weep from the weight of not being alone anymore. Jonah came from Samuel's shop just after sunrise, his sleeves rolled and soot on one cheek. He carried himself differently now, not without his limp, not without the pain that sometimes tightened his mouth, but with a new purpose in his shoulders. "You've got iron dust on your face," Ruth said. "That's because I work with iron. You worked one morning. And last evening. You sorted hinges. Important hinges." She reached up and rubbed the soot from his cheek with the edge of her apron. He protested as if he were 12 instead of 17, but he did not pull away until she finished. "How is Mr. Vale?" she asked. Jonah's expression shifted. Ruth saw it at once. "What?" "He's working." "That is not an answer." "He's working like he didn't breathe smoke last night." Ruth looked across the road. The blacksmith shop doors were open. Samuel stood inside near the anvil, shaping a length of iron with slower strikes than usual. He was upright, steady, but there was a stiffness in the way he turned. His cough had been bad when the smoke cleared. He had waved away every concern until Mrs. Roscoe told him he looked like a chimney and ordered him to drink hot water with honey. "Did he eat?" Ruth asked. Jonah looked guilty. "Jonah. He said he would." "That means no. I'm not his keeper." "No," Ruth said, lifting 2 corn cakes from the basket and wrapping them with a piece of fried potato left from Samuel's own pan the morning before. "Apparently that task has fallen into mismanaged hands." Jonah grinned. "Yours." "Watch the counter." "I can do that." "Sell coffee, do not give opinions." "I can do one of those." Ruth crossed the street before she could talk herself out of it. Samuel did not look up until she was just inside the shop. The heat met her first, warm and dry, carrying the smell of coal, oil, leather, and hammered metal. Morning light slanted through the open doors and caught dust in the air like tiny sparks. "You left your counter," he said. "I have a capable clerk." "Jonah." "Capable, not silent." Samuel set the hammer down. "That sounds accurate." She held out the wrapped food. "Eat." "I was going to." "When?" "Soon." "Soon is where meals go to die." His mouth twitched, but the humor faded when a cough took him. He turned away, pressing his fist to his chest, trying to make it smaller than it was. Ruth waited until it passed. "You should rest." "I have orders." "You have lungs." "I also have customers." "Dead men do poor business." He looked at her then, and something in his face closed. Ruth knew immediately she had touched a bruise she had not meant to touch. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Samuel wiped his hand on a cloth. "No need." "There is need if I was careless." He was quiet long enough that the forge popped in the silence. "My sister used to say things plain like that," he said. When I would work through supper or ride too hard or pretend I had no body to mind, she'd say, "Samuel, dead men mend no wagons." Ruth held the wrapped food between them. "She sounds sensible." She was. He took the food at last. Their fingers brushed again, but this time neither seemed surprised by it. Ruth looked around the shop to give him the privacy of eating. Tools hung along one wall in careful rows, though some still bore Mr. Larkin's old labels. A wheel rim leaned near the door. A child's small iron hoop sat on the bench, newly repaired. Beside the safe at the rear, a folded blanket had been laid across a crate. "You slept here," Ruth said. "I kept watch." "On the safe?" "Yes, Samuel. It holds your papers. It also holds yours. That is why I was already watching it." He took a bite of corn cake, leaving the rest of the matter where it stood. Ruth moved toward the safe. She did not touch it. What was her name? Samuel's shoulders stilled. Ruth regretted the question at once. "You don't have to answer." "I know." He set the food down on the anvil block and leaned one hand against the bench, not from weakness, though there was some of that, but as if the name itself required balance. "Abigail," he said. Ruth repeated it quietly. "Abigail." She was 23. Thought books could make a fair world if enough people learned to read them. Taught minors children in the evenings after cleaning rooms all day. A faint, painful smile touched his face. Stubborn, too generous, bad at choosing shoes for long walks. Ruth listened. Outside, her coffee counter carried on without her. She could hear Jonah's voice, a customer's laugh, cups knocking wood. But inside the shop, the past had stepped into the warm air and stood beside them. "She wrote me 3 letters, Samuel continued. First said the boarding house was hard but honest. Second said the charges were confusing. Third said not to come angry. He looked down at his scarred wrist. I came angry anyway." "What happened to your wrist?" "Stove pipe broke loose when I was searching the place. Burned through my sleeve. I thought I was rescuing her from a building. Truth was, the building wasn't the trap. The paper was." Ruth felt the words settle deep. "The man who held her contract," Samuel said, "had sold it before I arrived. Legal enough to make noise about. Rotten enough that everyone could smell it. By the time I found the trail, she had run with a family going west. I was 3 months behind her and proud enough to believe speed could mend foolishness." "You were trying to save your sister." "I was trying to be the hero after failing to be the brother who read her first letter properly." Ruth stepped closer. "That is a cruel sentence to keep saying to yourself." Samuel gave a low, humorless breath. "Some sentences keep saying themselves." "I know." He looked at her then, and the air changed. They were not speaking only of Abigail now. Daniel stood in the silence too. Daniel and his false debt. Daniel's name pressed into a ledger after death. Ruth's months of labor spent trying to clear a shame that had never belonged to him. She understood the shape of Samuel's guilt because she had been living inside one like it. "I kept paying," she said, "not just because I was afraid. Because some part of me thought if I paid it all, Daniel's name would be clean again. I thought that was love. Maybe it was only fear with flowers on it." Samuel's eyes softened. "It was love, Prut used it. That doesn't make it less love." The word struck her with such tenderness she had to look away. Outside, Jonah called, "Ruth, Mr. Daly wants to know if old coffee costs less." Ruth turned toward the door. "Tell Mr. Daly old questions cost extra." Samuel's quiet laugh followed her, rough from smoke but real. She stopped at the threshold and looked back. "Come eat the rest before it gets cold." "I will." "That is not the same as doing it." He picked up the corn cake and took another bite while she watched. "Better," she said. Then she returned to her counter with her face warmer than the forge could explain. By mid-morning, Deputy Mace came with news from Judge Whitcomb. The scorched loss sheets had been spread out to dry. 2 were ruined. 3 were readable. 1 showed the mining equipment had been signed under Prut's own authority, not Daniel S. Another listed the shed roof as unsafe 2 weeks before the collapse. The third had a note from Willard Finch saying repairs were delayed because Prout did not want to spend on timber until after spring freight season. Ruth heard all of it without speaking. Unsafe roof. Delayed repairs. Prout had not only forged a debt, he had known the shed was dangerous. Daniel's death had been called an accident because calling it anything else would have cost money. Jonah's face went gray. He knew. Deputy Mace held his hat in both hands. Looks that way. Ruth gripped the counter. The street tilted slightly, then steadied. This was a deeper pain, not the sharp relief of a false debt exposed, not the clean anger of a forged line in a ledger. This went backward into the day Daniel died, into the broken boards, the hurried burial, Prout's solemn face telling her the company had suffered losses too. Losses. As if Daniel had been one item among crates and wheels. Samuel had come to stand beside the awning. Ruth did not know when. She only knew he was there. "Where is Prout?" she asked. Mace's mouth tightened. "No sign yet. Judge sent a wire to El Paso and Mesilla Patrol. If he tries to sell freight assets or pull bank funds, word may catch him. And if it does, then he has a head start." Jonah slammed his fist against the counter. A tin cup jumped. Ruth turned to him. "Jonah. He killed Daniel." The words came out raw. No one corrected him. Ruth looked at Deputy Mace. Mace spoke carefully. "The papers show negligence. Maybe criminal negligence if the judge sees it so, but we do not know yet what a court will call it." "I know what I call it," Jonah said. His voice shook in a way that frightened Ruth more than shouting would have. Samuel saw it too. He stepped closer to Jonah, not too close. "Come to the shop." Jonah glared at him. "I don't want to sort hinges." "Good, I need coal carried." Ruth began. "Samuel." "He can carry small buckets," Samuel said. "Anger needs work before it becomes words a man regrets." Jonah looked ready to refuse. Then his shoulders slumped and he grabbed his walking stick. "I hate him," he said. "I know," Ruth said. "I hate that he gets to run. I know. I hate that Daniel can't see this." That broke her more than anything else. She reached for him, but Jonah pulled away, not cruelly, only with the desperation of a boy whose grief had become too large to be touched. Samuel waited. Jonah limped across the street beside him, jaw tight, eyes wet, carrying nothing because nothing was safe in his hands yet. Ruth watched them go. Mrs. Roscoe quietly took the coffee pot from the stove and poured for waiting customers without asking permission. Mr. Daly collected coins and placed them in a neat line beside the box. For several minutes, Ruth simply stood there seeing nothing but Daniel's hands and a roof Prout had refused to mend. Near noon, a rider came hard from the south road. Dust followed him into town. He pulled up near the telegraph office, spoke to Mr. Daly, and handed over a folded message. Daly read it once, then looked down the street toward Ruth. The look made everyone quiet. He walked to her counter slowly. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said, "this came from the relay station near Mesquite Wells." Ruth took the paper. The words were brief. "Pruitt seen southbound with locked trunk. Hired 2 men. Asked road to old Buttrfield stop. Possible border route." Jonah had come back to the shop doorway by then. Samuel stood behind him. Ruth looked at the message, then at the road leading south out of Las Cruces. Asap Prout was not gone. He was close, carrying a locked trunk full of whatever he had chosen over truth. And for the first time, Ruth understood that the story was no longer only about clearing Daniel's name. It was about what else Prout had taken, and how many lives had been quietly bent under papers he never meant anyone to read. The words from Mesquite Wells passed through Las Cruces like wind through dry grass. By noon, every person on Mesilla Street seemed to know that Asap Prout had been seen southbound with a locked trunk and 2 hired men. By noon, the story had grown legs of its own. Some said the trunk held gold. Some said it held deeds. Some said it held forged papers enough to ruin half the valley. Ruth did not listen to the guesses. She had learned the hard way that the truth was usually quieter than rumor and far more dangerous. She stood behind her coffee counter while the town hummed around her. the telegram from Mesquite Wells folded beside the first one in her apron pocket. Across the street, Samuel worked at the forge with Jonah nearby, but neither of them moved with ordinary rhythm. Samuel's hammer rose and fell slower than usual. Jonah forgot twice to answer when Ruth called him. Even Mrs. Roscoe, who had taken over pouring coffee when Ruth's hands betrayed her, kept looking south as if Prout might appear at the end of the street with his trunk, and his lies riding behind him. Deputy Mace came back from the courthouse just after 1. "Judge Whitcomb is sending me to Mesquite Wells," he said. "I'll take Ellis and 2 riders. We'll see if we can catch his trail before dark." Ruth wiped a cup with a cloth that had gone dry. "And if you find him?" "We bring him back if he has no lawful reason to refuse. If he resists, we send word to the territorial marshal." "Will that hold him?" Mace did not answer quickly enough. Ruth nodded once. "I see." "He has money," Mace said. "Maybe papers. Maybe men willing to swear anything for a fee. I won't lie to you, Mrs. Bellamy. Bringing him back may not be simple." "Nothing about him has been simple except the harm." The deputy looked toward the blacksmith shop. "Mr. Vale offered to ride with us." Ruth's hand stilled. Samuel had not told her. Across the street he must have felt her look because he turned from the forge. For a moment, road dust, sunlight, and all the noise of town seemed to sit between them like something neither had yet named. Ruth turned back to Mace. "Did you accept?" "I said I'd ask the judge." "And what did Judge Whitcomb say?" "He said a blacksmith has no badge, but a man who can fix a wagon wheel on a desert road may be useful." "That sounds like yes." "That sounds like Judge Whitcomb." Ruth looked down at the counter. The coffee had burned low in the pot. She lifted it, though no one was waiting. Mace softened his voice. "He asked to go because Prout may have freight papers, and he knows how to look for what matters." Ruth did not say what she was thinking. That Samuel also knew how to ride toward trouble because once long ago he had ridden too late toward his sister. That this time he might think speed could mend what papers had broken. That a man could call it duty when it was also grief wearing work gloves. "Thank you, deputy," she said. Mace touched his hat and left to gather his riders. Samuel crossed the street a minute later. He came without food, without cups, without any of the small offerings that had become his way of stepping gently into Ruth's mornings. He stopped at the customer side of the counter and rested both hands on the plank. "You heard," he said. "I heard from Deputy Mace. I was coming to tell you." "When?" "Now." Ruth hated the sharpness that rose in her. She had no right to it. He owed her nothing, and that was exactly what made the feeling more frightening. "You should have told me before offering." Samuel looked at her steadily. "You're right." That answer caught her off guard. She had expected explanation, perhaps defense. Men often mistook concern for permission to argue. Samuel only gave her the truth and left it there. Ruth folded the cloth in her hands. "Why are you going?" "Because Mace may need help if a wagon breaks, a horse throws a shoe, or Prout tries to hide papers in plain sight." That is the useful answer. "Yes." "What is the true one?" His eyes moved toward the road south. For a moment, Ruth saw how tired he was. Smoke still roughened his voice. Soot had settled in the lines of his hands no washing could quite clear. He should have been resting. Instead, he was preparing to ride after a man with hired guards and a trunk full of secrets. "The true one," Samuel said, "is that I know what it feels like to arrive after the paper is gone." Ruth's anger drained, leaving fear beneath it. "Samuel." "I won't be reckless." "You cannot promise that. Reckless men rarely know the hour it starts." "I can promise I won't go alone. I can promise I'll follow the deputy's lead. I can promise I am not riding to settle anything with my hands." She believed him. That did not help. Ruth glanced toward the shop. Jonah stood in the doorway, watching with a face too guarded for his age. He wanted to go too. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. not because he thought he could ride hard or fight men, but because anger had made him feel useless, and uselessness was the old wound he could least bear. "Jonah stays," Ruth said. Samuel nodded. "Yes." "Did he ask?" "Yes. And I told him the shop needed him." A small, painful smile touched Ruth's mouth. "That worked." "No. Then I told him you needed someone here who understood the papers in the safe." "That worked." "No." "What worked?" Samuel glanced at Jonah, then back. "I told him Daniel had already lost enough family to prove." Ruth looked away. For a few seconds the street blurred. Samuel reached into his vest pocket and took out a small key on a plain iron ring. He placed it on the counter. Ruth stared at it. "What is that?" "The safe key." "You wear it." "I have another hidden in the shop. This one stays with you until I return." "I can't take your safe key." "You can. It has your papers too." "Yes. Your sister's things." His face shifted slightly, but he did not pull the key back. "I know." That trust was too much. It came at her quietly, without demand, and still it nearly undid her. Ruth did not touch the key. Why? Because if something happens, you should not have to ask anyone's permission to open the door holding your own truth. The words settled between them. Ruth thought of locked cabinets, withheld ledgers, men who made women wait outside rooms where their futures were written. She thought of Daniel's Bible in Samuel's safe and Abigail's folded cloth beside it. She thought of the first morning Samuel had asked her to sit and drink coffee, as if rest were not a thing she had to earn. At last she picked up the key. It was heavier than it looked. "Come back for it," she said. "I plan to." "No, not plan." Her voice lowered. "Choose it." Samuel held her gaze. "I choose it." There was more in the words than the ride. Both of them knew it. Neither of them reached for it yet. By 2, the riders were ready outside the courthouse. Deputy Mace rode a bay gelding, Ellis beside him, 2 ranch hands behind. Samuel brought his own gray horse from the livery, a steady animal with scarred knees and patient eyes. Before mounting, he walked once more to the blacksmith shop. Ruth watched from the awning as he spoke to Jonah. She could not hear the words, but she saw Jonah's head drop, saw Samuel place a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder, saw Jonah nod hard as if agreeing cost him dearly. Then Jonah held out a small wrapped bundle. Samuel opened it. Inside was a hinge, newly cleaned and filed, small enough for a cabinet door. Jonah said something. Samuel looked at the hinge, then tucked it carefully into his coat pocket. When he returned to the street, Ruth stood waiting by the counter. She had wrapped 2 corn cakes, dried meat, and a small cloth of coffee grounds. "I sell breakfast," she said. "I do not send riders hungry." Samuel accepted the bundle. "How much?" "For you." His eyes softened. Ruth lifted her chin. 5 cents. He placed a nickel on the counter. It steadied them both, the trade, not charity, not rescue, not farewell sweetened into something too fragile to bear. A nickel for food, a key for trust, a ride for truth. Samuel mounted. Jonah came to stand beside Ruth, his face tight but dry-eyed. The riders turned south. Dust rose beneath the horses' hooves. Samuel looked back once. Ruth did not wave. She held the safe key in her closed fist and watched until the road swallowed him. Only after the riders disappeared did Jonah speak. "He'll come back." Ruth looked at the empty road. "He chose to." The afternoon stretched long after that. Without Samuel's hammer, the street sounded wrong. Ruth had not realized how much she had come to measure the day by the ring of iron across the road. Now the blacksmith shop stood open but quiet, and Jonah moved through it alone, checking the banked forge, sorting tools, and pretending not to watch the south road every few minutes. Ruth closed the coffee counter early, not because customers stopped coming, but because Mrs. Roscoe said gently, "There is no shame in being done for today." And for once Ruth believed her. She carried the coin box into the room behind the livery, then stopped. The room felt smaller than it had that morning. The bed, the stove, the chair, the shelf with 2 plates and 1 cracked mug. The place had held her grief, her labor, Jonah's restless sleep, and Daniel's Bible until the day before. It had protected them as well as it could, but now she saw how much fear had lived in the corners. She took the safe key from her pocket and crossed to the blacksmith shop. Jonah looked up from the workbench. "You all right?" "No." He nodded, "Me neither." That made her smile sadly. They went together to the iron safe. Ruth unlocked it with Samuel's key. The heavy door opened with a low iron groan. Inside lay the papers: Daniel's Bible, rent receipts, the telegrams, Samuel's shop documents, the folded cloth she had tried not to study before. Now she saw that the cloth had come loose at one edge. Inside was a faded blue ribbon, a small school primer, and 3 letters tied with string. Abigail. Ruth did not touch them. Jonah stood quietly beside her, as if he too understood that some things could be seen only with respect. Ruth placed Samuel's key on the safe shelf, then thought better of it and returned it to her pocket. She took out Daniel's Bible, opened to the pressed flower, and slid both telegrams deeper between the pages. A loose sheet fell from the back cover. Ruth frowned. She had not seen it before. Perhaps it had been tucked there by Daniel and hidden beneath the worn lining. Perhaps moving the Bible, opening it in new places, had shaken it loose. She picked it up carefully. It was Daniel's handwriting. Not a letter, a list, names, dates, amounts. At the top, written in Daniel's plain hand, were the words: "Prut deductions, men underpaid." Ruth's breath stopped. Jonah leaned closer. "What is that?" Ruth read down the page: "Freight hands, stable boys, widow accounts, storage fees. Wage shortages, small sums beside each name, too small alone to raise a storm, large together." Daniel had been tracking them. At the bottom, one line had been underlined twice. "Ask Willard to copy ledger before confronting P." Ruth sat back on her heels. The room seemed to tilt, not from fear this time, but from the sudden arrival of Daniel as more than memory. Daniel had known something was wrong before he died. He had not been careless. He had not been blind. He had been gathering proof. And perhaps Prut had known it. Jonah's voice shook. "Ruth." She folded the sheet with trembling care. The story was wider than her debt, wider than Daniel's name in pencil, wider than one unsafe roof. Prut had been taking from men who could least afford to lose, and Daniel had started to see the pattern. Ruth placed the list inside the Bible with the telegrams. Then she closed the safe and locked it. Outside, the evening light lay soft on Mesilla Street. The South Road was empty. Ruth stood in Samuel's quiet shop with the safe key in her hand and Daniel's newly found list burning like a live coal in her mind. For the first time, she wondered if the locked trunk Prut carried was not only meant to save him. Maybe it held the proof Daniel had died trying to gather. And somewhere on the road to the old Butterfield stop, Samuel Vale was riding toward it. Samuel Vale had ridden south before, but never with a town's silence following him. The road out of Las Cruces ran through open country where the land seemed to hold its breath between settlements. Mesquite, greasewood, and pale sand stretched toward low hills, and beyond them the old Butterfield route lay like a scar across the desert. In better years, stagecoaches had carried news, money, letters, and tired passengers through those lonely stops. Now some of the old stations stood half-used, half-forgotten, good for shade, bad water, and men who did not wish to be easily found. Deputy Mace rode at the front, his hat low against the sun. Ellis and the 2 ranch hands kept a steady line behind him. Samuel rode slightly back, not because he wished to be apart, but because he had learned long ago to watch what others missed. A fresh wagon could lie to a careless man. It could show deep tracks where the ground was soft and vanish where stone took over. It could turn aside at a wash, follow cattle prints, double back through brush, or stop long enough for men to shift weight and change the story the wheels were telling. But iron told truths. At the first dry wash, Samuel dismounted and crouched near a rut where a wagon wheel had struck rock hard enough to scrape. He touched the mark with 2 fingers. "Prut's wagon has a loose rim on the left rear," he said. Deputy Mace looked back. "How do you know it's his?" "I shod that wheel 2 weeks ago, told his driver the rim needed resetting. Prut said he'd wait." Ellis snorted. Man wouldn't spend a dime even to keep his own wagon whole. No, Samuel said. He would rather gamble the road would forgive him. Mace leaned in the saddle. Will it slow him? Eventually, if he's carrying a heavy trunk sooner. They rode on. By late afternoon, the sun had turned white and hard. Dust dried Samuel's throat. The smoke from the freight office still sat in his chest, and every deep breath scraped. He did not cough if he could help it. Coughing drew attention, and attention drew concern, and concern had begun to wear Ruth Bellamy's face. That was the trouble. He had meant to help her with a ledger, a paper matter, a door with hinges. He had meant to stand near enough that Prout could not twist her words in private, then return to his forge, his orders, his quiet shop, and the narrow life he had built after Abigail died. Instead, Ruth had sat on the stool behind her counter and taken the coffee he poured. She had looked at him with tired eyes that still refused to lower themselves before a bully. She had listened when he spoke of Abigail without trying to make grief pretty. She had accepted his safe key like it mattered and told him to come back for it, choose it. The words rode with him. Samuel touched the small hinge Jonah had given him, tucked inside his coat pocket. The boy had pressed it into his hand before they left. For the trunk, Jonah had said. Samuel had looked down at the little cabinet hinge, newly cleaned, neatly filed. What trunk? Whichever one needs opening. It had been a boy's attempt at courage, but Samuel carried it like a promise. They reached Mesquite Wells near sunset. It was not much of a place. A low adobe relay house, a corral leaning against the wind, a pump that squealed when worked, and a woman named Mrs. Cade who ran the station with a shotgun behind the counter and a ledger cleaner than most church registers. She remembered Prout, hard man in a black coat. She said, pouring water into tin cups, talked like the dust owed him rent. That's him, Ellis said. Mrs. Cade nodded toward the southwest. Came through yesterday near dusk. Wagon, 2 riders. Paid cash for water and asked about the old Butterfield stop. Did he say why? Mace asked. Said he had goods bound for a buyer. What kind of goods? Didn't offer and I didn't ask. Folks who want questions usually pay less. She looked at Samuel, left with trouble too. The wheel, he asked, left rear, rim knocked loose, driver argued. Prout told him to keep moving. Samuel and Mace exchanged a glance. How far to the old stop? Mace asked. 10 miles if you like bad road, 8 if you like worse. Could they make it before dark? With that wheel, maybe, if the wagon didn't come apart first. Mace set his cup down. We ride. Mrs. Cade stepped out from behind the counter. Not blind, you don't. Wash Road forks after 3 miles. South Fork leads to the stop. West Fork leads to gullies and smugglers who shoot before they spell their names. Prout asked too many questions about both. Do you have a boy who can guide? I have myself. Mace blinked, ma'am. Mrs. Cade took the shotgun from behind the counter and handed it to a gray-haired man sleeping in a chair. Ezra, wake up. Mind the station. The old man opened one eye. You going to meddle? I'm going to protect my ledger from being dirtied by fools. Samuel liked her immediately. They left Mesquite Wells as the sun dropped low enough to redden the earth. Mrs. Cade rode a small brown mare with no patience for other horses and led them to the wash road without wasting words. Shadows lengthened. The desert cooled. Every sound seemed to carry farther now. After 3 miles, they found the fork. Samuel dismounted again. The tracks told the story clearly enough even in fading light. The wagon had paused. One rider had gone west, circling wide. The wagon had taken the South Fork. The second rider had followed it. Prout was either splitting attention or laying caution behind him like nails. Mace frowned. He sent one man west. To see if anyone followed, Mrs. Cade said. Or to meet someone, Samuel added. Mace looked at the darkening south road. We stay with the wagon. They rode slower now. Twice Samuel heard the faint clink of metal ahead. Once he saw marks where the loose wheel had dragged sideways near a stone. The wagon was failing. That meant Prout could not be far. Night came fully before they saw the old Butterfield stop. It stood in a shallow basin beside a dry creek bed, a long, low building with part of the roof caved in and one wall patched with newer boards. A broken corral leaned behind it. No lamp burned in the windows, but a wagon stood near the side wall, its canvas cover pulled tight. The left rear wheel sagged. Mace lifted one hand and the riders stopped. No one spoke. A horse nickered somewhere behind the building. Then a man's voice muttered. Another answered sharply. Samuel leaned close to the deputy. At least 2 men. Prude. Maybe inside. Mace's jaw tightened. We do this careful. I'm not starting a shooting match over papers in the dark. They tied the horses low in a stand of mesquite and moved on foot. Samuel's chest hurt with every breath, but he stayed behind Mace and carried only a lantern, unlit, and the tools at his belt. Ellis circled with one ranch hand toward the corral. Misses. Cade remained near the wash with the horses, though Samuel suspected she would not stay there if trouble began. When they reached the wagon, Samuel put his hand on the wheel. The rim had split. No wagon would go farther without repair. From inside the old station came Prute's voice. Then carry it. Another man answered. That trunk weighs more than a coffin. It is worth more than your complaints. Samuel felt Mace stiffen beside him. The deputy stepped to the doorway. Asap Prute. Silence fell hard. Then wood scraped. A chair, perhaps. Mace raised his voice. This is Deputy Harlan Mace of Las Cruces. Judge Whitcomb has issued a warrant for your business records concerning the Bellamy matter and related freight accounts. Come out peaceably. For a moment, no one moved. Then Prute laughed, not loudly, not wildly, worse, calmly. Deputy, you are a long way from your own street. Close enough to carry you back. I have committed no crime by transporting my own property. Then you won't mind showing what's in the trunk. That trunk contains private papers. Mace glanced at Samuel. Samuel said quietly, so did the ledger. Inside, something shifted. Then one of the hired men appeared at the doorway with both hands visible. He was broad, dusty, and frightened enough to be sensible. I ain't shooting no deputy, he said. No one asked you to, Prute snapped from behind him. The man stepped outside anyway. Ellis came from the side and took him by the arm. A second hired man followed after a tense pause, cursing under his breath but unarmed. He too seemed to have decided Prute's money was not worth a grave. That left Prute. He came to the doorway with his coat buttoned, hair neat, and face pale in the moonlight. Even cornered at a ruined stage stop, he looked offended rather than afraid. You are making a mistake, he said. Mace kept his hand near his holster but did not draw. I've been told that a lot this week. Prute's eyes moved past him and settled on Samuel. The blacksmith, of course. Samuel said nothing. You think this concerns you because a widow poured coffee where you could watch her. Mace stepped forward, careful. But Prute smiled, sensing the wound he wanted. Tell me, Mr. Vale, do you chase every woman's sorrow down a road, or only the ones that remind you of your sister? Samuel felt the words hit. Not because Prute knew the whole story. Men like him rarely needed the whole story. They only needed enough to press where pain showed. Samuel's hand tightened at his side. For one dangerous second, anger rose in him with the old shape. Socorro, Abigail's empty room, the burn on his wrist. His own fists useless against papers already moved. Then he thought of Ruth standing behind her counter saying, no, not plan, choose it. He let the anger pass through without taking the reins. No, Samuel said quietly, I came because your wheel is broken. Prute's smile faltered. Samuel stepped toward the wagon, not the man. You can run on lies, Prute, not on a split rim. Ellis laughed once under his breath. Mace nodded toward the trunk inside. Bring it out. Prute moved fast then, but not toward a gun. He turned and bolted deeper into the station. Mace lunged after him. Samuel followed with the unlit lantern. Inside the old stop, moonlight cut through roof gaps in pale strips. A table lay overturned. A locked trunk sat near the back wall. Prute ran toward a second door hanging crooked on leather hinges. Samuel saw what the deputy did not. The floor beyond the table had rotted under dust. Mace left. The warning came just in time. The deputy shifted. Prout did not. His boot punched through a weak board and he fell hard, catching himself against the doorframe with a cry of pain. Samuel reached him first. Prout tried to pull free, but his leg was trapped to the knee. The rotted planks had splintered around him. "Help me," Prout gasped. Samuel looked down at the man who had forged Daniel's debt, threatened Jonah, burned records, and used Ruth's grief as a purse he could empty. For a moment the old anger whispered, "Leave him." Then Samuel knelt. "Hold still," he said. Prout stared at him. "Hold still," Samuel repeated, "or you'll cut yourself worse." Using a pry bar from his belt, Samuel worked the boards apart. Mace held Prout by the shoulders. Ellis brought the lantern, now lit, and yellow light filled the broken room. It took 5 minutes to free him. When they did, Prout's ankle was swollen but not broken. Mace bound his hands. Prout sat on the floor, breathing hard, humiliation doing more damage to him than the fall. Samuel stood and turned to the trunk. It was iron-banded with 2 locks. Mace looked at Prout. "Keys?" Prout said nothing. Mace searched his coat and found 1 ring, but neither key fit. Samuel crouched by the trunk. Jonah was right. "What?" Mace asked. Samuel took the small hinge from his pocket and smiled faintly despite the ache in his chest. "Wrong hinge, right trunk." He studied the locks, strong but not clever. Prout had trusted weight more than craft. Samuel worked slowly, not damaging more than needed. The first lock opened after several minutes. The second took longer. Prout watched with hatred sharp enough to cut. At last the lid lifted. No gold lay inside, no jewels, only papers, bundles of contracts, wage sheets, storage liens, freight claims, deeds folded into oilcloth, personal notes tied with string. A smaller tin box holding cash and bank drafts. Lives reduced to handwriting. Mace lifted the top packet. Ruth Bellamy's name was not the first. There were many before hers. Samuel saw familiar marks at once. Pencil beneath ink, cramped lines squeezed into full pages, figures changed in the margins. Men underpaid by 50 cents here, $1 there. Widows charged storage on goods already sold. Ranchers billed for freight damage they had never caused. Laborers marked as owing advances they had never received. And there, in a packet tied with faded red string, was a list in Daniel Bellamy's handwriting, a longer list than the one Ruth had found. Samuel recognized the hand from the paper in Daniel's Bible. Prout had stolen the rest. At the bottom of the packet was a note. "If anything happens to me, ask Willard where Prout keeps the trunk." Daniel had known. Samuel closed his eyes briefly. Then he handed the packet to Mace. "This goes straight to Judge Whitcomb." Mace took it with care. His face looked older in the lantern light. Prout laughed from the floor, but the sound was thin now. "You think papers make saints of dead men and heroes of coffee widows?" Samuel turned to him. "No," he said, "they make a record. That is what frightens you." Outside, Mrs. Cade called, "You boys done admiring each other. I'd like to reach my bed before winter." Ellis helped carry the trunk. The split wheel meant Prout's wagon would not move, so they loaded the trunk across 2 horses with rope and blankets. Prout was placed on one of his own horses, hands tied, ankle wrapped, pride broken enough to keep him quiet for the first mile. They rode back under a sky full of stars. Samuel's cough worsened in the cold night air, but he kept riding. Near dawn, Las Cruces appeared as a low, dark line against the paling east. The town was not awake, not fully, but one place already showed movement beneath an awning. Ruth's coffee counter. She was there before sunrise, as always. Samuel saw her before she saw him. She stood wrapped in her shawl, the blue pot steaming beside her, face turned toward the south road. Jonah stood beside her, one hand braced on his stick. When the riders came into view, Ruth did not run. She gripped the counter as if holding herself in place by force. Samuel touched the safe key missing from his neck and felt the hollow where it had rested. He had chosen to come back. And now, as the first light opened over Mesilla Street, he carried toward Ruth the proof Daniel had tried to leave behind. Ruth saw the riders before the rest of the town woke. At first they were only shapes moving along the south road, dark against the pale blue edge of morning. She stood beneath the livery awning with both hands wrapped around the warm handle of the coffee pot, afraid that if she blinked the shapes might change into strangers or dust or nothing at all. Jonah saw them too. He pushed himself upright from the crate, his walking stick scraping against the planks. "Is that them?" Ruth did not answer because her throat had closed. The figures came nearer. Horses, 4 riders, then more. Deputy Mace in front, Ellis behind, Mrs. Cade riding with her shotgun laid across her lap like it belonged there, and Samuel Vale slightly to the right, his shoulders straight though his face was gray with exhaustion. Behind them rode a saproot, hands bound, one ankle wrapped, his black coat dusty and torn at the hem. Across 2 horses, roped tight between blankets, was an iron-banded trunk. Ruth set the coffee pot down carefully. The sound brought the morning back. A tin cup rattled. A horse snorted in the livery. Somewhere above the street a shutter opened. Samuel's eyes found hers before he reached the awning. He had come back. That was the first truth, the one that struck before the trunk, before Prout, before any paper Daniel had left behind. Samuel had gone out under the weight of old grief and returned under the first light, carrying himself like a man who had chosen the road home before he ever rode away. Ruth did not run to him. She wanted to, and that frightened her enough to keep her feet still. Deputy Mace reined in near the courthouse steps. "Wake Judge Whitcomb," he called to Ellis. "And get Daly. We'll need wires sent." Mrs. Cade looked down at Ruth from her mare. "You the coffee widow?" Ruth blinked. "I suppose I am." The older woman studied her, then nodded. "Heard enough about you last night to expect you taller." Jonah muttered, "She gets that a lot." Ruth shot him a look, but Mrs. Cade laughed. Samuel dismounted more slowly than the others. When his boots hit the ground, he swayed once, very slightly. Ruth saw it, so did Jonah. "You're hurt," Ruth said. Samuel shook his head. "Tired." "You look like death after a hard ride." "That is a kind description." "It is an honest one. I miss those." His voice was rougher than before, scraped by smoke and cold night air. Ruth wanted to reach for him, but half the street was gathering now. She settled for taking a cup, filling it with coffee, and holding it out. 3 cents, she said. Samuel looked at the cup, then at her. The faintest smile moved through the weariness in his face. He placed a nickel on the counter. "Keep the change." "I did not say coffee was 5. You said 3, I overpaid." "Dangerous habit." "I'll watch it." He took the cup. Their fingers touched around the tin, and this time Ruth did not pull away first. Jonah's eyes moved between them, but wisely he said nothing. The quiet did not last. Prout was helped down from his horse by Deputy Mace and one of the ranch hands. He tried to stand as if he had not been brought back tied and dusty before sunrise, but his bad ankle betrayed him. The stumble cost him more pride than pain. Ruth watched him without the old fear. That surprised her. She had expected terror to return at the sight of him. Instead, she felt a deep, tired anger and something almost like mourning. Not for him. For all the mourning she had given him. All the coins. All the worry. All the hours she had spent believing survival required silence. Prout's eyes found her. "You look pleased with yourself," he said. Samuel straightened, but Ruth spoke first. "No," she said, "I look awake." The words landed harder than shouting would have. Prout's mouth tightened. Judge Whitcomb arrived in a coat thrown over his nightshirt, spectacles crooked, hair wild, and temper fully dressed. "If this trunk contains anything less than the sins of Pharaoh, deputy, I will be displeased at the hour." Mrs. Cade dismounted. "It contains enough paper to make your breakfast cold." "Then bring it in." They carried the trunk into the courthouse. Ruth followed with Jonah beside her. Samuel came last, coughing once into his fist and pretending he had not. Ruth heard it anyway. Inside the judge's office, the trunk was set on a long table. Morning light pushed through the windows and lay across the iron bands. Prout sat in a chair near the wall with Deputy Mace standing beside him. His hands remained tied. His face had gone smooth again, but his eyes were restless. Judge Whitcomb looked at the broken locks, opened without a key. Samuel nodded. "Yes, sir." "Was it necessary?" Prut refused the keys. Prut spoke sharply. Private property was damaged by unlawful force. The judge turned his head slowly. "Mr. Prut, I am currently wearing boots without socks. Choose your next complaint with care." Mrs. Cade snorted. The trunk lid was lifted. No one spoke for a long moment. Even in the growing light, the contents seemed heavy. Bundles of contracts tied with twine, oilcloth packets, wage sheets. Notes in Daniel's hand, bank drafts, deeds, storage liens, men's names, women's names, numbers, lives all flattened into paper because paper had been the tool Prut trusted most. Judge Whitcomb began sorting with slow care. "Deputy, write what I call." May sat with a pencil ready. Packet 1, Freight Wage Deductions 1886 through 1888. Packet 2, Storage Liens. Packet 3, Livery Parcel Correspondence. Packet 4, Bellamy Matter. The judge paused over the red-tied bundle. "And this?" Samuel looked at Ruth. Ruth stepped closer. The top sheet bore Daniel's handwriting. She knew it instantly, not because handwriting was proof to a court, but because love learns the shape of a person's hand in ordinary things. Grocery lists, repair notes, birthday wishes, the slant of a D, the open loop of an L, the pressure of a man who wrote quickly because work was waiting. Judge Whitcomb lifted the sheet carefully. Ruth read the title, Prut Deductions, full list. Her knees weakened. Jonah put one hand under her elbow. For once she let him. The list was longer than the one hidden in Daniel's Bible. Page after page of names, dates, amounts, notes. Men docked for tools they had returned. Widows charged storage on goods already collected. Freight hands underpaid for night loading. Stable boys charged for torn harness they had not used. A Mexican teamster named Luis Ortega marked for a broken axle on a wagon Prut had already written as damaged before hire. Mrs. Roscoe charged twice for a stove delivered late to her boarding house. Mr. Daily docked telegraph fees for messages sent by Prut himself. The room grew quieter with every name. Then came a page marked shed roof. Ruth stopped breathing. Judge Whitcomb's expression changed as he read. "What is it?" Jonah asked. The judge did not answer immediately. He looked at Prut first. Prut stared at the wall. Judge Whitcomb read aloud, not loudly but clearly enough for every person in the room to hear. "Roof beam cracked over South Freight Shed. Reported by Daniel Bellamy, January 2nd. Prut refused repair until spring season. Daniel requested written notice. Willard witnessed." Jonah's grip tightened on Ruth's arm. The judge turned the next page. January 9th. Rain opened seam over beam. Daniel moved sacks from south wall. Prut ordered freight returned to shed. Said delay would cost more than timber. Ruth pressed Samuel's handkerchief to her mouth. She had kept it without meaning to. Now it was in her pocket, and she held it like it was the only thing keeping sound inside her. Judge Whitcomb turned the final page. January 17th. Daniel intends to bring matter before town committee if roof not braced by Monday. The room seemed to fall away. Monday. Daniel had died on January 17th. He had intended to speak. Ruth saw it then, not the way rumors had painted it, not the way Prut had folded it into debt and responsibility, but nearer to truth. Daniel standing under a roof he knew was unsafe, trying to move freight or men out of danger. Daniel arguing perhaps. Daniel believing a town committee would care if only he could put the matter before them. Daniel dying before Monday came. The grief rose so swiftly Ruth could not stand against it. Samuel's hand came lightly to her shoulder, not claiming, not pulling, only there. She leaned into it before she could stop herself. Prut laughed once from the wall. It was the wrong sound. Every face turned toward him. "You all want a noble dead man," he said, "so you make one." Bellamy was a freight hand who stuck his nose where business did not concern him. Ruth lifted her head. For months, she had imagined what she might say if Prut's lies ever lay exposed. She had thought the words would come with fire. Instead, they came quietly from a place deeper than anger. He was a man who noticed you stealing from people who could not afford lawyers. Prute's eyes cut to her. He was a man who wrote things down because he believed truth could outlast fear. The room was still. "And he was my husband," Ruth said. "You do not get to make him small because his honesty frightened you." Prute opened his mouth, but Judge Whitcomb struck the table once with his palm. "Enough." The old judge rose. He looked tired now, but not uncertain. "Asap Prute, pending formal territorial review, you will be held on charges concerning forged debt, fraudulent collection, destruction of business records, attempted removal without clear authority, and whatever charge the marshal deems fitting regarding criminal negligence in the freight shed collapse." Prute stood too quickly, then winced from his ankle. "You have no right." "I have a courthouse, witnesses, recovered records, a deputy, and a headache. I have enough." Deputy Mace took Prute by the arm. As he was led out, Prute looked once more at Ruth. The old threat tried to return to his face, but it could not find the room it once had. Too many people had seen the papers. Too many names had been read aloud. Too many doors had opened. When he was gone, Ruth sat in the chair he had left. For a while, no one asked anything of her. That was mercy. Judge Whitcomb sorted more papers. Mace returned. Mrs. Cade asked if anyone planned to pay her for the lost sleep, then accepted coffee instead. Mr. Daly arrived and sent wires to El Paso, Socorro, and the territorial marshal. Willard Finch came in pale and shaking, and when he saw Daniel's full list, he covered his face with both hands. "I knew some," he whispered. "Not all." Ruth looked at him. He was young, frightened, guilty, not innocent perhaps, but not the hand that had built the trap. "Then tell all now," she said. He nodded. By midday, the town had changed again, not with celebration, not yet. The truth was too wide for that. Men came to the courthouse and found their names in Daniel's list. Some cursed, some stood silent. Mrs. Roscoe laughed when she saw the stove charge, then cried with one hand over her eyes. Luis Ortega, who had nearly left town over the axle debt, sat on the courthouse steps and did not move for an hour. Ruth returned to the coffee counter because she did not know where else to put herself. Samuel walked with her. "You should rest," she said. "So should you." "I have coffee to sell. I have iron to mend." They reached the awning and stopped. Across the street, the blacksmith shop stood open in the sun. Behind its rear wall, the safe held Daniel's Bible and Abigail's letters. The thought linked them in Ruth's mind in a way she did not know how to speak. Samuel coughed again, harder this time. Ruth turned fully toward him. "No." He blinked. "No what?" "No forge today." "I have." "No." "Ruth." The sound of her name in his voice caught them both. It was the first time he had said it without Mrs. Bellamy between them. She softened but did not step back. "You breathed smoke, rode through the night, opened a trunk and brought back half the town's stolen life. The horses can wait. The hinges can wait. Even iron can wait." His eyes rested on her face. "Can coffee." She looked at the counter, at the pot, at the cups waiting in their row. Then she looked at Jonah, who stood nearby pretending not to listen. "Jonah," she said. "Yes." "Can you pour coffee without giving opinions?" "No." "Can you pour coffee while giving fewer opinions?" "I can attempt that." "Good." She stepped out from behind the counter. Samuel watched her, almost wary. "Where are we going?" "To Mrs. Roscoe's. She has stew, beds, and the forceful manner of a military commander. You need all three." "And you?" "I need to make sure you obey." Something warm moved through his tired expression. "That sounds like work." "It is not charity." "No," he said softly, "I know." They walked together down Mesilla Street in the bright afternoon. No one cheered. No music rose. The day did not pretend pain had vanished because truth had arrived. Daniel was still gone. Abigail was still gone. Jonah still limped. Ruth still woke before dawn with too few coins and too much memory. Samuel still carried grief in the careful quiet between his words. But the false debt was broken. The trunk was opened. The town had begun to see itself honestly. And as Ruth walked beside Samuel, close enough that their sleeves brushed once, then again she felt something she had feared to name return with the simplest shape. Not rescue, not escape. A future. For 3 days, Las Cruces lived inside open papers. Judge Whitcomb moved the trunk to the courthouse records room and placed 2 men outside the door until the territorial marshal arrived from Santa Fe. Deputy Mace slept in a chair beside the hallway stove the first night, his hat over his eyes and his hand near the ledger as if paper, once rescued, still needed guarding like a wounded man. Ruth returned to the coffee counter every morning. That surprised people. It even surprised her. After Prout was brought back, after Daniel's full list was read, after men began to find their own names folded into the stolen years, some folks seemed to expect Ruth to stop working, as if justice should arrive with a chair and permission to rest. But coffee still needed boiling. Corn cake still needed turning. Jonah still needed breakfast before crossing to the blacksmith shop. Rent still had to be paid until Judge Whitcomb decided who truly owned what. A life did not become easy just because a lie had been caught. Besides, the counter steadied her. It was plank, cups, steam, coins, hands. Things she understood. Only now, when she stood behind it, the street stood differently around her. Men who had once walked past without looking at her now removed their hats. Women came with lists of names their husbands remembered from Prout's accounts. Freight hands spoke in low voices, ashamed of debts they had believed were theirs. Mrs. Roscoe brought fresh rolls each morning and insisted Ruth sell them for a share. Mr. Daly kept a running note of wires sent and refused payment until the matter found its feet. And Samuel Vale, for the first time since she had known him, was not across the street at dawn. He had not gone far. Mrs. Roscoe had put him in the small east room at the boarding house after the ride back and declared the blacksmith shop closed by medical authority, though she had no such authority except the kind no sensible man challenged. Samuel slept nearly 12 hours the first day, woke angry at his own body, coughed hard enough to lose the argument, and slept again. Jonah managed the shop in his absence, which mostly meant keeping the forge banked, taking small repair orders and telling customers, "Mr. Vale will decide that," in a voice that tried to sound older than it was. Ruth watched him cross the street each morning with Samuel's spare apron folded over one arm. The limp remained, but shame had begun to loosen its grip on it. He no longer tried to hide every uneven step. He had work now, real work, paid work, work that made his hands black and his eyes bright. On the 4th morning, Samuel returned. Ruth saw him before he reached the counter. He came from Mrs. Roscoe's boarding house wearing a clean shirt, his dark hair still damp from washing, his face thinner from exhaustion but no longer gray. He walked slower than usual, and every few steps his breath caught. Still, there he was, crossing Mesilla Street with 2 tin cups in one hand. Ruth tried not to smile. She failed. "You are supposed to be resting," she said when he reached the awning. "I rested." "You slept under orders." "Still counts." "You look pale." "You look tired." "I sell coffee. Tired is part of the price." "Then I'll have 2 cups." "For yourself." "For one stubborn coffee seller and one blacksmith under watch." Ruth looked at the cups. "You brought them back." "They were yours first." "They were yours. You brought them that second morning." "I used your coffee." "You used your nerve." He smiled faintly. "That too." She poured the cups. He paid 6 cents without argument, then stood on the customer side of the counter as he had in the beginning. Something about that touched her more than if he had stepped behind it. Samuel always seemed to know when closeness needed permission. Ruth lifted her cup. "You should sit." "You never liked that argument." "I like it better when aimed elsewhere." "There's only one stool." "You are a blacksmith. Find a crate." Jonah, who had been listening from the shop doorway, called, "He has 6." Samuel turned slightly. "You are supposed to be sorting rivets." "I can sort and testify." Ruth laughed before she could stop herself. The sound moved through the morning like something newly freed. Samuel looked at her, and for a moment the noise of the street softened around them. Then Mr. Daly came hurrying from the telegraph office with a yellow envelope in hand. "Judge wants you both," he said, breathless. Territorial Marshal arrived. Ruth set her cup down. Samuel did the same. The courthouse was already crowded when they arrived. Not inside the judge's office. Judge Whitcomb had put an end to that after the first morning by announcing that anyone who wished to breathe down his neck could first pass the bar examination. But the hallway, steps, and front yard held nearly half the town. The territorial marshal was a lean man named Andrew Kell, with a gray mustache, dust on his coat, and eyes that seemed to read a room the way Samuel read wheel marks. He had come from Santa Fe after Judge Whitcomb's wires made the matter too large for local handling. Prout sat inside the office in a chair near the wall. His ankle was splinted. His coat had been brushed. He looked less like a prisoner now, and more like a banker forced to attend an unpleasant meeting. But the neatness did not restore what the trunk had taken from him. His power had depended on rooms where he controlled the papers. Now the papers sat on Judge Whitcomb's desk, and every page spoke in a voice he could not easily silence. Willard Finch sat near the window, pale but composed, with his hands folded tightly in his lap. Mrs. Roscoe sat behind him like a guard dog in a good bonnet. Marshal Kell looked up when Ruth entered. "Mrs. Bellamy." "Yes." "My condolences for your husband." The words were simple, but they did not sound like a habit. Ruth nodded. He turned to Samuel. "Mr. Vale, Deputy Mace says you opened the trunk." "Yes, sir." "Without destroying the papers." "Yes, sir." "That was useful." Samuel accepted the praise with the uncomfortable expression of a man handed a shirt that did not fit. Judge Whitcomb pushed a packet across the desk. "Marshal Kell has reviewed enough to take Prout under territorial authority. Formal charges will be decided after depositions, but he will not be managing freight, collecting debts, holding livery rooms, or misplacing ledgers while that happens." Ruth heard the words carefully. He will not may not should not, will not. Prout's gaze shifted toward her, cold but smaller now. Marshal Kell opened a notebook. "Mrs. Bellamy, I need your statement regarding the debt collection, the refusal to show the ledger, and the threats made against your rooms and counter. We can take it now or later." "Now," Ruth said. Samuel moved as if to step back. Ruth looked at him. "Stay." He stilled. Prout's mouth twisted. "Touching." Judge Whitcomb did not even look up. "Mr. Prout, I have found silence improves your position more than speech." For the next hour, Ruth spoke. At first her voice felt thin. She told them about Daniel's death, about Prout coming 3 days after the burial, about the summary paper he showed but would not let her hold. She told them the amount. She told them how much she had paid week by week, month by month. She told them how he had threatened removal, Jonah's work, the counter beneath the awning. She told them how the ledger opened and Daniel's name sat cramped between inked lines. She did not make herself sound braver than she had been. That mattered to her. She said when she had been afraid. She said when she had believed him. She said when shame kept her quiet. She said when Samuel's note made her ask the first right question. She said Daniel would never have signed a freight loss in pencil because Daniel sharpened pencils for lists but signed obligations in ink. At that, Willard Finch lowered his head. When Ruth finished, her hands were shaking in her lap. Samuel's hand rested on the back of the chair beside her, not touching but near enough for her to know she was not back in Prout's office alone. Marshal Kell wrote the last line. "Thank you, Mrs. Bellamy." Then Jonah gave his statement. Ruth had not expected that. He stood near the desk with his walking stick in one hand, face pale but determined. He spoke of Prout's threats, of the way Ruth had counted coins, of the repair work Prout tried to stop. Then, voice roughening, he spoke of Daniel. "My brother was careful," Jonah said. "He made me add columns twice when I was 12 because he said numbers were a fence. If you leave a gap, somebody will walk through and take what isn't theirs." No one moved. He wouldn't leave Ruth with a debt he didn't explain. He wouldn't leave me either. Ruth looked down because the tears had come again, quiet this time. When Jonah sat, Samuel gave his own statement. He spoke plainly without adding drama. He described the note he left for Ruth, the ledger line, the smoke in the freight office, the cash box under the stove, the road to Mesquite Wells, the trunk, the hired men who chose not to fight, Prute's fall through the rotten floor and the opening of the locks. Prute interrupted only once. He omits that he has attached himself to the widow's affairs for personal reasons. The room went silent. Samuel looked at him. Ruth felt heat rise into her face, but Samuel's voice remained calm. "My personal reasons are these," he said. "My sister was harmed by a man who used contracts to keep her poor and frightened. I recognized the method. Mrs. Bellamy had a false debt used against her. Her husband's records helped prove it. If noticing a pattern is personal, then yes." Prute smiled, and the rest. Samuel did not answer quickly. Ruth wished suddenly that she had told him he did not have to answer at all, but Samuel looked at Marshal Kell, not Prute. "The rest is that Mrs. Bellamy is someone I respect." The words were not a proposal, not a declaration. Not enough for gossip to turn into something cheap, yet Ruth felt them in the center of her chest. Prute's smile died. Marshal Kell closed his notebook. "That will do." By late afternoon, Asap Prute was taken from the courthouse and placed in a guarded wagon bound for Santa Fe. The town gathered to watch, but no one cheered. Perhaps no one knew how. The harm he had done was too practical for shouting, too woven into cupboards, pay envelopes, rent receipts, and burial bills. People stood with arms folded, faces solemn, watching a man who had made himself large through other people's fear become simply a man with a splinted ankle and guarded wrists. As the wagon rolled past the livery awning, Prute looked once at Ruth. She met his eyes. He wanted fear from her. She could see that. A final payment. A last coin dropped into the old box. She gave him nothing. When the wagon turned the corner, Jonah exhaled beside her. "Is it over?" Ruth watched the dust settle. "No." His face fell. She touched his arm. "But the part where he decides what we are allowed to know is over." That evening, the town held a meeting in the schoolhouse. It had been called to discuss recovered accounts, freight operations, and temporary management of the livery parcel until legal ownership could be clarified. Ruth went because her name was in too many papers not to. Samuel went because half the wagons in town needed repairs Prute had delayed paying for, and because Ruth asked if he would walk with her. The schoolhouse smelled of chalk, lamp oil, and crowded wool. Men and women filled the benches. Judge Whitcomb sat at the teacher's desk with Marshal Kell's preliminary notes. Mrs. Roscoe had Daniel's list copied into neat columns. Mr. Daly held telegraph replies. Willard Finch stood near the wall, ready to answer questions and looking like each one might cost him breath. The meeting was not simple. Truth rarely made money appear where it had been stolen. Some people wanted repayment at once. Others wanted freight accounts frozen. Several argued over whether the livery should close until the matter settled. A rancher claimed Prute owed him for damaged tack. A washerwoman said the storage lien against her late father's trunk had been false. Louis Ortega stood and, in careful English, explained that Prute had kept him from leaving town by claiming an axle debt that did not exist. The more they spoke, the more Ruth understood the size of Daniel's work. He had not only made a list, he had noticed people, small amounts, quiet injuries, the kind of theft powerful men trust will never gather in one room. At last Judge Whitcomb removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. "We need a temporary committee to review claims against Prute's accounts and keep freight moving. 3 people, 1 familiar with the books, 1 with local business, 1 trusted by the injured parties." Someone said, "Willard knows the books." Willard looked ready to faint, but he nodded. "Mr. Daly was chosen for local business because he could write clean, add faster than most, and had offended the fewest people." Then silence fell over the third seat. Ruth felt eyes turn toward her before anyone spoke. "No," she said. Mrs. Roscoe lifted a brow. "No one asked yet." I heard the room thinking. A few people laughed softly. Judge Whitcomb looked at her. "Mrs. Bellamy, your husband gathered the first proof. You paid under the false debt. You know better than anyone what these papers cost." "I sell coffee." "You also read receipts better than half the men who signed them." Ruth shook her head. "I have Jonah, the counter, the rooms. I cannot sit on a committee and pretend my life has empty hours waiting." Samuel sat beside her, silent. She looked at him, expecting perhaps encouragement. Instead he said, "Then make the hours worth paying for." The room quieted. Ruth turned to him. Samuel held her gaze. "If the town needs your labor, the town can pay for it, not with gratitude, with money." Mrs. Roscoe struck her cane once on the floor. "Sensible." Mr. Daly nodded. "Committee stipend from recovered freight funds once authorized. Until then, I'll advance paper and ink." Judge Whitcomb looked around. All in favor of Mrs. Bellamy serving as claims representative with fair compensation. Hands rose, not every hand, enough. Ruth sat very still. For months Prude had taken her labor through shame. Now the town was asking for it openly and offering to value it. She looked at Jonah. He smiled at her, small and proud. Ruth stood. "I will do it," she said. "But I will not be called Charity, Symbol, Poor Widow, or Daniel's Good Woman while I'm doing it. If I serve because I can read a crooked receipt and because I know what it feels like to pay one." Judge Whitcomb nodded, agreed. "And Jonah keeps his work with Mr. Vale." Samuel answered before anyone else could. "He does." Jonah's smile widened. After the meeting, people lingered outside beneath the stars. Some spoke of accounts, some of weather. Some simply stood near one another because a town that had been cheated needed time to remember how to gather without suspicion. Ruth walked toward the livery with Samuel beside her. "You made them pay me," she said. "I suggested it." "You made it sound obvious." "It was. To you." He glanced at her. "It should have been to everyone." She carried those words a few steps. At the blacksmith shop door she stopped and took the safe key from her pocket. She held it out. Samuel looked at it. "You came back for it," she said. "I did." He did not take it at once. Inside the shop the forge was dark. The safe sat in the rear shadows, holding Daniel's Bible and Abigail's letters. Outside, Mesilla Street lay quiet, no longer watched by Prute's office lamp. Samuel closed Ruth's fingers back around the key. "Keep it tonight," he said. "Why?" "Because tomorrow I want to ask you something, and I don't want the answer mixed with returning what I lent." Ruth's heart changed pace. "What kind of something?" His face held the same seriousness she had seen the first morning when he bought coffee and offered rest like a fair trade. "Breakfast," he said. She blinked. "Breakfast." "Not at your counter. Not because papers are burning or writers are leaving or some man needs proving wrong. Breakfast at my shop, if you'll sit long enough to eat it." Ruth looked at him. "That sounds familiar." "I hoped it might." The quiet between them warmed. "What are you cooking?" she asked. "I have not decided." "Then your proposal lacks structure." "It is not a proposal." The words came too quickly and both of them heard what they had brushed against. Samuel looked down, then back up. "Not yet." Ruth could have stepped away from that. A month ago she would have, maybe even a week ago. Instead she held his safe key in her hand and smiled. "I open at 5, she said. "I light the forge at 4. That was not an invitation. "No," he said, but it was not a refusal. For a moment Daniel's memory did not stand between them like a wall. Abigail's did not either. The dead were present, yes, but gently, like witnesses, like names finally spoken with honor instead of weight. Ruth crossed the street to the rooms behind the livery. Jonah was waiting by the door, trying and failing to look uninterested. "Well?" he asked. "Well, what? Do I need to be in the shop early tomorrow or very late?" Ruth stared at him. He grinned. She shook her head and went inside, but she was smiling when she closed the door. That night Ruth slept deeply for the first time in nearly a year. In the morning, before the town woke, she would still grind coffee. She would still count coins. She would still tie her apron and step into the cold. The world had not turned easy, but across the street, a blacksmith would light his forge at 4. And for once, Ruth Bellamy allowed herself to wonder what it might feel like to sit down before the day demanded anything from her, and eat breakfast with a man who had never once asked her to be weaker so he could feel strong. The first breakfast Ruth Bellamy ate in Samuel Vale's blacksmith shop was not much to look at. There were eggs cooked a little too long, biscuits that leaned hard toward the edge of burnt, potatoes cut unevenly, and coffee poured from Ruth's own pot because Samuel admitted without shame that hers was better. He had set everything on a plank laid across 2 crates near the open shop doors, where morning light could reach them, and the forge stayed cold behind him by Ruth's firm instruction. "It lacks elegance," Samuel said, looking at the meal. Ruth sat on the crate opposite him, hands wrapped around her cup. "It has food." That is the lower end of praise. "It has warm food." A great climb. "It has warm food made by someone else." Samuel looked at her then, and the corner of his mouth lifted. "There it is." Ruth took a bite of the biscuit. It crumbled in a way that suggested surrender. Samuel watched her face closely. "Well, it would survive a flood." "That bad?" "No, that sturdy." He laughed quietly, and the sound filled the shop in a way the hammer usually did. Ruth found she liked it better. Outside, Mesilla Street was waking. Jonah had opened the coffee counter himself that morning, though Ruth had stood at the shop door for 5 full minutes making sure he remembered the order of things. Cups left, coin box under the plank, corn cakes wrapped, no credit without names written down, no lifting the water bucket if Ellis came by and could do it with 2 good arms. Jonah had endured the instructions with exaggerated patience. "Ruth," he had said, "I have watched you do this every morning for nearly a year. And yet you remain 17. I will try to recover from it." Samuel had given a cough that might have been a laugh, and Ruth had finally crossed the street to sit down. Now she watched Jonah from the shop while he poured coffee for Mr. Daly and said something that made the old telegraph man smile. Her brother stood behind the counter as if he belonged to the morning, not as a burden placed inside it. That alone made the burnt biscuit worth eating. Samuel followed her gaze. "He'll do well." "He already is." "Yes," Samuel said, "he is." Ruth looked back at him. The open shop made his face clear in the early light. He still looked tired. There were shadows beneath his eyes and a rasp in his voice that had not fully healed, but something in him had loosened too, not vanished. Grief did not vanish because truth arrived, but the hard edge of it had eased like iron taken from the fire and shaped before it cooled. "Did you sleep?" she asked. "Some." "Some" is not a proper answer. It is the true one. "What kept you awake?" Samuel turned his cup slowly in both hands. "Abigail." Ruth waited. "After Prut was taken, after the statements, after the meeting, I thought I would feel lighter." He looked toward the safe at the rear of the shop. "Instead, I kept thinking that helping bring him in did not change what happened to her." "No." "And it did not change Daniel being gone." "No." He nodded once, as if he respected the honesty more than comfort. Ruth set her cup down. "I think maybe justice is not a cure. Maybe it is only the part that lets a wound close clean." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. "That sounds like something a person learns the expensive way." "It was not cheap." "No," he said softly, "it was." Across the street, Mrs. Roscoe arrived with a covered basket, took one look at Jonah's arrangement of cups and began changing things. Jonah objected. Mrs. Roscoe ignored him. Ruth smiled into her coffee. Then she sobered. "Judge Whitcomb asked me yesterday if I wanted Daniel's list copied into the town record." Samuel leaned back slightly. "What did you say?" "I said yes." He nodded. "Good." "I also asked if Abigail's boarding house papers could be sent to Marshal Kell. The ones in your safe, if you agree." Prute's methods were not the same man, maybe not the same place, but perhaps someone in Socorro still remembers who held those contracts. Samuel became very still. Ruth's heart tightened. "I should have asked before speaking." "No," he said, though his voice had gone rough. "You ask now. I do not want to open a hurt that you have chosen to keep folded." His gaze moved again to the safe. "I kept it folded because I thought that was respect, or cowardice. Some days I couldn't tell which." He drew a breath carefully. "If there is a record to be made, make it. If there is a man still living who did that to her, let his name be written somewhere besides my memory." Ruth reached across the crate plank. Not far, just enough to place her hand over his. Samuel looked down at their joined hands as if the sight itself required courage. Neither of them moved away. Later that morning, the certified copies from El Paso arrived by stage. By then Judge Whitcomb had Daniel's list, Prute's trunk papers, Willard Finch's testimony, and more townspeople waiting outside the courthouse than the building could hold. The territorial marshal had already taken Prute toward Santa Fe, where the wider charges would be handled, but his absence did not make the work smaller. The committee began in the schoolhouse. Willard Finch sat at the front with ledgers stacked beside him, and a face that looked pale but determined. Mr. Daly sharpened pencils until there was a neat row of them beside his ink bottle. Ruth took the third chair, placed Daniel's copied list in front of her, and looked out at the people waiting. For a moment the old fear tried to rise. Who was she to sit there? A coffee seller, a widow, a woman who had believed a false debt for months. Then she saw Jonah near the back, apron still blackened from the shop, smiling as if he had never doubted her. She saw Samuel standing beside the door, not in front of her, not behind her, simply near. She saw Mrs. Roscoe with her cane folded over both hands, Luis Ortega with his hat in his lap, freight hands, laundresses, stable boys, ranch wives, men who had been ashamed of crooked debts and women who had hidden pawn tickets beneath mattresses. People Daniel had noticed. People Prute had counted on staying separate. Ruth picked up the first paper. "We will go one name at a time," she said. "No shouting, no skipping. No man's claim is too small to be read." And they began. The work took weeks. Some claims proved simple: a doubled fee, a false storage charge, a wage deduction written twice. Others tangled themselves in missing receipts, dead witnesses, and men who had moved away. Not every coin came back. Not every wrong could be mended. But enough did. Enough for Luis Ortega to clear the Axel debt and leave town only because he chose to, not because shame chased him. Enough for Mrs. Roscoe to recover the stove charge and announce she would spend the money on curtains ugly enough to offend Prute in spirit. Enough for 3 freight hands to receive back pay. Enough for Jonah to find Daniel's name spoken not as tragedy alone, but as the man who had written the first careful list. Ruth kept pouring coffee through all of it. Only now the counter changed. At first it was practical. Mrs. Roscoe's rolls sold well beside Ruth's corn cakes. Samuel built a better plank counter with hinged leaves so Ruth could close it against wind. Jonah fitted the coin box with a proper lock and looked offended when Ruth said it was clever, as if cleverness had been obvious and her surprise unnecessary. Then came chairs. Only 2 at first, because Ruth insisted she was not opening a boarding house in the street. Then 4, because old Mr. Daly liked to sit with his cup and read telegram headlines aloud. Then 6, because freight hands began stopping after early loading. Samuel built each chair from salvaged wood and iron braces, plain but strong, and Ruth complained every time he delivered one. "You are crowding my awning. You are filling my mornings." That is not an argument. It might be. By summer, the coffee counter had a name no one officially gave it. Folks simply began saying, "Meet me at Ruth's." Ruth pretended not to care. She cared very much. Prute never returned to Las Cruces. Word came in pieces over months. The forged debt charges held. The destroyed records and trunk papers brought more witnesses. The negligence in Daniel's death proved harder, as Judge Whitcomb had warned, but it did not disappear. Even when the law moved slower than grief wanted, Prute's businesses were stripped from his hands and placed under review. The livery parcel, after much searching of old deeds, was found not to belong to him at all. He had managed it through a lease he had stretched far beyond its words. Ruth was offered the rooms behind the livery at a fair rent by the proper owner, an elderly widow in Santa Fe who wrote that any woman able to survive Asa Prute's bookkeeping deserved first chance at the lease. Ruth signed in ink. She pressed the pen hard enough that Jonah teased her for trying to carve the letters into the table. In August, Samuel rode to Socorro with Marshal Kell's letter and Abigail's papers. Ruth did not ask him not to go. She wanted to. The old fear still knew how to speak in her. It whispered that roads took people, that unfinished grief could pull a man away, that a woman was foolish to wait with hope in both hands. But love, she was learning, was not a locked room. So she packed him food, charged him fairly, and handed him back his safe key. "You'll need it," she said. Samuel looked at the key, then at her. "I have another." "I know." "Then why give this one back?" "Because this time, I am not afraid you will disappear if I do." He closed his fingers around it slowly. "I'll come back," he said. "I know." His eyes softened. "That sounds like trust." "It is. Don't become vain over it." "I'll try to remain humble." "You'll fail quietly." He smiled, mounted, and rode east. He was gone 12 days. When he returned, he brought no grand victory. Only a record, a sworn statement from a former boarding-house girl, a name, a note that the man who had held Abigail's contract had died the year before, but his ledger had not. Marshal Kell would see what could be done for the women still named in it. Samuel told Ruth all this at dusk inside the blacksmith shop, the safe open behind them and Abigail's blue ribbon on the workbench between his hands. "I wanted him alive," Samuel admitted. "I know." "I wanted to ask him if she was afraid." Ruth's eyes stung. "But the woman who gave the statement said Abigail taught her letters in the evenings, said she used to say, 'If they write it down, we can learn to read it.'" Ruth smiled through tears. She and Daniel would have liked each other. Samuel looked at the ribbon, and for the first time since Ruth had known him, his grief seemed to stand without shame. "Yes," he said, "I think they would." He placed the ribbon back inside its cloth, not hiding it now, only keeping it safe. Autumn came soft to Las Cruces, with cooler mornings and dust that settled faster after wagon wheels passed. The coffee counter grew busier. Jonah's work at the blacksmith shop became more than a kindness, more than training. He had a gift for fine repairs, for small mechanisms, for locks that stuck and hinges that sagged. Samuel paid him proper wages and corrected anyone who called him the helper. "Apprentice," Samuel would say. Jonah pretended not to glow. On the first cold morning of November, nearly a year after Daniel's death, Ruth walked to the cemetery before dawn. She went alone at first. She carried no flowers, only a cup of coffee in a tin cup and one corn cake wrapped in cloth. Daniel's grave sat beneath a cottonwood at the edge of the little burial ground, where the mountains could be seen when the morning was clear. She stood there for a long time. "I am not paying it any more," she said softly. The wind moved through the dry leaves. "I know now it was never yours. Maybe some part of me knew sooner. Maybe I was too tired to know what I knew." She knelt and brushed dust from the wooden marker. "Jonah is working with iron. You would laugh at how serious he looks when he talks about rivets. The town says your list saved them. I think you would say the list only did what people finally had courage to finish." Her voice trembled. "I miss you." There it was, the plainest truth. No papers could settle it. No court could repair it. No new love could replace it, and the goodness of that was its own mercy. Daniel did not have to be erased for Ruth to keep living. "I am going to be happy again," she whispered. "Not because I forgot you, because I did not." When she stood, Samuel was waiting by the cemetery gate. She had not heard him come. He held his hat in both hands and stood far enough away that her grief could have its own room. Ruth walked to him. "You followed me." "No. Jonah told me where you were going and then threatened to hit me with a crutch if I let you walk back alone in the cold." "What? He does not own a crutch." He said he would borrow one. Despite the tears still on her face, Ruth laughed. Samuel looked toward Daniel's grave. "May I?" She nodded. He walked with her back to the cottonwood, removed his hat, and stood quietly. "I never met him," Samuel said after a moment, "but I owe him thanks." Ruth looked at him. "For writing things down," he said. "For loving you well enough that you knew the difference when a man did not." Ruth took his hand. They stood there as the sun lifted over the desert, not as the past loosened, but as it found its proper place behind them. That December, Samuel asked Ruth to marry him. He did it badly, according to Jonah. There were no flowers because Samuel had forgotten them in the shop. There was no polished speech because the moment came while Ruth was arguing with him about whether the new awning braces were too heavy. He had stood there holding a length of iron, listening to her explain why practicality mattered, and then said, "Ruth, I would like to build every unnecessary, sturdy thing beside you for the rest of my life." She had stared at him. Jonah from the counter dropped a cup. Mrs. Roscoe said, "That is the least romantic sentence I have ever approved of." Samuel looked suddenly aware that he was still holding the iron brace. "I had planned to ask better." Ruth's eyes filled with tears and amusement all at once. "When?" "Tonight." "Where?" "At the shop." "With what?" He hesitated. "Soup." Jonah covered his face. Ruth stepped closer. "Samuel Vale, are you asking me now or inviting me to soup?" "Both if possible." She laughed then, full and helpless and alive. "Yes," she said. Samuel looked stunned. "To both." "To both." They married in February, in the same schoolhouse where the town had first gathered to read Prout's Wrongs aloud. Ruth chose that place because she wanted joy spoken where fear had once been answered. Daniel's Bible lay on the front desk, not as a shadow, but as witness. Abigail's blue ribbon was tied around Ruth's bouquet beside a small pressed desert flower. Jonah stood with Samuel, wearing a clean shirt and boots he had polished twice. Mrs. Roscoe cried openly and denied it to anyone foolish enough to mention it. Mr. Daly sent a telegram to Mrs. Cade at Mesquite Wells, and by some miracle of stubborn travel, Mrs. Cade arrived the morning of the wedding with Ezra half asleep in the wagon beside her. The ceremony was simple. No one pretended Ruth was beginning life for the first time. No one pretended Samuel came without sorrow. They stood before the town as two people who had known locked doors, false papers, cold mornings, and grief that could make even kindness feel dangerous. Then they chose each other anyway. Afterward, beneath the livery awning, coffee was served free for 1 hour until Ruth discovered Jonah had made the decision without permission. "You cannot give away my coffee," she said. Jonah grinned. "It's a wedding." "It is still coffee." Samuel placed $3 in the coin box. Ruth looked at him. "That is too much." "It's for the town." "The town drinks heavily." "I noticed." Mrs. Roscoe lifted her cup to Ruth's. Someone repeated it, then another. By spring, the awning sign was painted properly. Not large, not fancy, just black letters on sanded wood. Ruth's Morning Coffee. Underneath, in smaller letters, Jonah insisted on adding. It read, "Hot coffee, corn cakes, fair accounts." Ruth claimed the last part was unnecessary. The town claimed otherwise. Samuel's blacksmith shop and Ruth's counter became two halves of the same morning. The hammer rang after the first coffee poured. Jonah crossed between them so often that customers began leaving tack repairs beside the coffee pot and coffee orders near the anvil. Ruth complained. Samuel built a shelf to make the system worse. Jonah called it efficient. 1 year later, on a cold March morning, Ruth opened the counter before dawn as always. The street was quiet. The mountains were still dark. The blue coffee pot steamed in its place. Jonah, now taller and stronger through the shoulders, unlocked the shop across the street. Samuel came from the back room carrying 2 cups, his hair untidy, his shirt sleeves rolled, his face softened by sleep and familiar affection. "You're early," Ruth said. "I live here." "That does make punctuality easier." He poured coffee and handed her 1 cup. She took it, then sat on the stool behind the counter before he could ask. Samuel noticed. She lifted her cup. "Do not look pleased with yourself." "I wouldn't dare." "You are daring silently." "I'll improve." "No, you won't." He smiled. Across the road, Jonah struck the first light in the forge. Orange glow touched the shop walls. A wagon creaked at the far end of the street. Mr. Daly would come soon. Mrs. Roscoe would complain the coffee was too strong and drink 2 cups. Someone would bring news. Someone would bring a broken hinge. Someone would need a receipt read carefully before signing. Life had not become simple. It had become honest. Ruth looked at the counter Samuel had built, the chairs he had added, the sign Jonah had painted, the street that had once watched her struggle and now met her by name. She thought of Daniel beneath the cottonwood, Abigail's ribbon in the safe, Prute's trunk in territorial records, and all the small truths that had found their way into daylight because someone had written them down and someone else had finally asked to read. Samuel leaned against the post beside her. "Breakfast after the rush." "What are you making?" "Biscuits." Ruth looked at him. "I have improved." "You have claimed improvement before." "Jonah agrees." "Jonah eats anything." Mrs. Roscoe agreed. "Mrs. Roscoe likes you too much to be trusted." Samuel held out his hand, palm up, as if offering not proof but invitation. Ruth looked at it a moment. Then she placed her hand in his. The first wagon stopped at the counter. A man climbed down, rubbing sleep from his face. "Hot coffee?" he asked. Ruth stood, still holding Samuel's hand for one extra heartbeat before letting go. 3 cents a cup, she said. "Corn cakes, 2 for a nickel." The man nodded toward Samuel, and him. Ruth glanced at the blacksmith, at the man who had once crossed the street with 2 cups and asked why she never sat down, at the life that had opened not like a rescue, but like a door finally unlocked from both sides. "Him," she said, reaching for the coffee pot. "He pays full price." Samuel laughed. The town woke around them, bright and cold and true. And Ruth Bellamy Vale, who had once stood behind a little counter believing survival meant never needing anyone, poured the first coffee of the morning with her husband beside her, her brother across the street, and her heart no longer locked behind grief. Some things are not healed by forgetting. Some things are healed by being held rightly. A name cleared, a list read, a door opened, a breakfast shared, and a woman who had stood too long finally learning that sitting down did not mean surrender. It meant she had found a place where she was safe enough to rest.